I believe that life has a lot to teach us if we not only allow it to, but seek it. Tenzin Lamten, as I know him as, a Tibetan Buddhist monk living in Woodstock, New York, where I previously resided, is my guest in this first podcast. He is the embodiment of seeking and allowing the truth and meaning to come his way. I believe he serves as an inspiration to those that care about what's deeper to our lives. What is our purpose? I hope you all enjoy. All right, so first episode, I am introducing, and I got a few names to say. First of all, Tenzin Lamten, that's what I know you by.
Mm-hmm.
Second name, I'm going to look at the book as I'm reading this out loud because I haven't fully practiced it. Bhikkhu Nyanadhammika, or not?
Nyanadhammika.
Okay, yeah, I was off. Fine. And then Richard Zeikowitz,
Yes.
as some still know you by.
Mm-hmm.
So this is all one person I'm talking about who has quite the journey to share, and I'm very interested in learning more about it. He has a book written called Goal in Progress, The Detours and Diversions of a Spiritual Journey. And there's a lot to it. It's all mostly based on your spiritual journey, and then there are the detours and diversions where you became back in, or when you moved back into society and you had very interesting experiences from, I'll open up this page right here where you give a synopsis of, this is very brief, but from Ananda Marga Yogi, which is a part of Hinduism, right?
Mm-hmm.
To San Francisco poet / new wave dancer, expatriate writer, jazz club manager, English professor and literary scholar, Tibetan Buddhist lay practitioner, Tibetan Buddhist novice monk, Thai forest Buddhist monk, Benedectine novice, Greek Orthodox monastic, Orthodox Jew, and then back to Buddhism, first as a layman and then as you are currently a monk. So when you finished writing this book, you were in Austin, Texas, right?
Well, actually, I was in Minnesota.
Oh, okay.
Yes, but the Austin, Texas, and the monastery in Minnesota are connected. They're both of the Burmese tradition and Theravadan Buddhism. That's the early stratum of Buddhism. And so I wrote it. I finished writing it just a little bit over a year ago. So it's not completely up to date.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in Minnesota when I wrote it, in rural Minnesota, this very small Burmese monastery. And then I moved to Austin, Texas after that.
Nice. And where we are currently is Woodstock, New York, and also Tibetan Buddhist monastery.
Yes.
Yeah, so I want to mostly go in chronological order,
Mm-hmm.
although I'm sure we'll have a lot of detours and diversions,
Sure.
as the title tells us. But before even the beginning of your spiritual journey, which I'm not going to reveal everything in the book, but, I just want to, use the major moments to talk through. That mostly started when you were in college at SUNY Oneonta. And it started with a psychedelic experience with mescaline, I believe.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So I want to talk about that. But before that, I'm curious just to ask you, before college, did you have any type of longing or a feeling that you had a calling towards a spiritual or religious life of any sort, or it wasn't until then?
That's a good question. Actually, as from my name, it's clear that I have a Jewish background, a Jewish New Yorker born in Brooklyn, in the heart of New York. But, my family, we were very culturally Jewish, but really non-observant. However, I was bar mitzvahed, as was my brother. We belonged to a conservative synagogue. But after my bar mitzvah, that was it. I said, okay, this is not really helping at all. I don't really have any connection to this. And my father was quite happy to cancel the temple membership. And I didn't have any spiritual inclination at all. In fact, when I went to Oneonta, I started out as a biology major, as a pre-dental, and I was going to be a dentist, which was my idea, not my parents' idea. And the reason why is that I wanted to be a country dentist, because I really had gotten to the point, once I got to Oneonta and I realized how beautiful it was, just being in the countryside, and so the opposite of New York City, especially Queens, I thought, I want to be a dentist in a small town like Oneonta. And all through until my senior year, I had no real spiritual connection and no experience with psychedelic drugs until my senior year. I began smoking pot on a regular basis as a sophomore. That would have been 1973, just to give people a sense that we're talking about, of course, in the just slightly post-hippie era. I was a little bit too young for the hippies, but somehow the effect of the hippies was still with us in the early 70s, of course. And that's when I began, basically recreational, because I was a very diligent student as a biology pre-dental student. So I didn't have a lot of time, just maybe on weekends. But then when the book opens with my senior year, which is just exactly 50 years ago, with that first mescaline experience, that was a catalyst that began. And the fact that realizing I was on a spiritual journey didn't really occur until I moved to Ithaca the next year. But the mind started opening with the drug, and that really began.
Yeah, so you feel like that initiated the idea that there's something beyond this.
Yes, beyond the material level, beyond the level of reality that I was used to, seeing things differently. And that's also when it just occurred to me as just a flash during not the first trip, but one of those early trips, was that I'm not going to be a dentist. That's certainly not something I really want to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but that was something I did not want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to talk more about that as we go along, because one word that you've used throughout the book a little bit, and I've heard this word a lot in the monastery, is the word supramundane, to describe the mundane world outside of spiritual life. And it's been an interesting thing for me, because I also have had my, I guess, dissatisfaction. I've had that itch where I'll be in a place and it just eventually feels like I need more. That there's got to be something more to life than this. And I think that's something a lot of people relate to. It takes people in many different directions. But with this specifically, pursuing spirituality and feeling like you needed the monastic life, there's definitely a theme throughout that of that feeling. But so with the upbringing that you had, did you have any family that I guess tried to pull you into any type of religiousness, or because you were saying your dad was happy to cancel the membership?
Yeah. Yes. No. And in fact, I suppose my mother came from a slightly more observant Jewish family, but they were not at all religious. They never went to synagogue. But, my grandmother kept kosher. She lit the Sabbath candles, my maternal grandmother. And I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up, because we lived in a small apartment in Queens, and I shared a room with my brother. And so in school holidays, we were just so happy just to go someplace else. And so both sets of grandparents lived in Brooklyn. And so I tend to spend more time with my maternal grandparents. And I remember her lighting the Sabbath candles, but, there was no sense of being religious at all, and no push that I should get deeper into it. So that really all occurred later, and certainly not. In fact, I think that I distanced myself from my family as I began my journey, because I did not want to be affected and influenced by what I saw as a very traditional, conventional way of life that I really, again, this is the early 70s, so this is a different time period, that I really did not really want any part of it, and I didn't want to be influenced by.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's interesting. I mean, did you feel like being that it was all about tradition and it's the culture that you guys were mostly practicing, did you feel like you had family members that were practicing because they felt connected with it in a deeper way, or it really was just, we're born Jewish, this is what we do, and that's it?
Yeah, and again, we did very little. I think the only thing I remember, my parents never went to synagogue on the Rosh Hashanah, the Yom Kippur. Mm-hmm. The only thing we did, we had Passover Seders when we were young, and we lit the electric menorahs. I think when I first started Hebrew school, my mother used to remind me this, that at a point I wanted them to be more religious, or at least more observant, not religious, observant, because I was somehow, at first I was really, I guess, taken in by it. But then I really began to really dislike Hebrew school, because it was just, after a whole day in school, I had to go to a synagogue for a couple of hours of Hebrew school, and I resented it. I had to take a bus to get there. So I resented it after a while. But no, there was no one really at all, at least in my early years, spiritually oriented, and I couldn't even influence people later on. No one really was really open to it, even later.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I guess, transitioning into the era of you starting with psychedelics and opening your mind. First of all, I think it's pretty fitting that we're doing this in Woodstock. Because that's really where it started. I mean, it was going on throughout the country, but to bring New York City into this hippie movement and this mind expansion was really interesting, and it brought some people into the spiritual path. So one thing I'm curious about, because you were mentioning in your book, you had multiple psychedelic experiences. A lot of them were very profound. Some of them not as much, but usually they were learning experiences, to say the least. At this point, because you stopped doing psychedelics after college, I think you had one more with your friend.
Well, in Ithaca, a couple of times in Ithaca. One time when I took the double dose.
Yes, which sounded intense. So, I mean, at this point, when you're writing about these things and reflecting on that time, and even later on, you compared that longing for this dramatic effect, similar, there's been a different concept in all the religions, but in Buddhism specifically, like enlightenment, trying to imagine it, and at one point you were, we'll get more into this, but you were transitioning your mind frame to have a less longing for the dramatic, super profound visual type of effect that you compared to hallucinogenic drugs. So I'm curious at this point, do you believe that psychedelics have still spiritual potential? And I guess, what is your overall perspective on it looking back now?
Looking back now, I think while I was still until I got to Ithaca, like when Oneonta was really when I did most of the psychedelics, it was really only a 1 year period, basically. I was not thinking so much spiritual, I was thinking more of mind opening. I remember one book that was really very much I was affected by was a book called Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, which was written in the 1950s, I think, actually. And the whole idea was opening the doors of perception, basically opening your mind. And we used to spend hours just listening to music. And that's really what we did. With Michael, my tripping buddy, and the people in the house where I was living, we would spend hours listening to music. And that's where I began my spirituality, if you like, was through music. Because we would listen to mostly classical and jazz. And I had never really listened to that music before at all. And that, I think, with the drugs opened up the idea of just hearing the music was putting me in a sort of a state that I really wasn't defining as spiritual, and certainly not as a way of life, but in the sense of just hearing beauty that I'd never really seen or heard before. And that would also transfer into seeing, especially living in the beautiful countryside of Oneonta, which is similar to Woodstock, beautiful rolling hills, and just exploring that and just seeing the beauty. Everything seemed enhanced from the drugs. But it's only in Ithaca, which is where I moved after Oneonta, and I saw that my friends were not going to live the communal life that I was hoping for, some kind of rural, communal, hippie life, because communes were very popular in the 70s. That was sort of definitely a connection to the hippie era. People wanted to have these communes living in the country and close to the land, growing your own food and just getting stoned and just, having just kind of a nice life. And I saw my friends were not going to do this. I just went off on my own to Ithaca, New York, which was a great place in the 70s. It was really this very progressive, very new age conscious, and also for spiritual groups. You could find different types of groups to meditate with. And that's where I first, came in contact with Buddhism. And at the same time, which is a very important part of my spiritual journey, is not only the spiritual aspect, was this sort of quest for some kind of community. I didn't just want to be by myself experiencing some kind of altered reality. I wanted to live in a community of people who are all somehow on the same journey, at least similar journeys. And I did have this sort of, I suppose, in my early 20s already in Ithaca, this sense of a monastic calling, because I thought that is the only way I would have a community of people. And the only models I knew, and again, only vaguely, were Christian models, because I didn't know about Buddhist monasticism, and there certainly wasn't any Jewish monasticism. And so I thought, well, I remember saying on several occasions to people, I said, if I was born Catholic, I think I would just easily be a Catholic monk. But I knew that was not going to be possible. So I figured there must be some way in an Eastern religion that I could find some kind of monastic community. And that began my search for something that would be a community of like-minded people living together and supporting each other.
Yeah, that ends up being a theme throughout the book.
Mm-hmm.
To add context, we live in a sangha, spiritual community, which that's the word that we use in Buddhism. And they're throughout the country, different religions, which you experience multiple ones. Mm-hmm. And there is a theme starting with, which I'm inevitably gonna get ahead of myself and then reel it back. But when you went on a spiritual odyssey from living in Ithaca, New York, mm-hmm. with your roommate at the time, Ananda, mm-hmm. who you met from a posting in town?
In town in Ithaca, I was looking for... I wanted to move out of college town because I thought I'd had enough of it. And I had a car now, a little Volkswagen Beetle. And I thought, well, let's see, maybe I could find someone to share an apartment with. And I saw this notice in this natural bakery in Ithaca, downtown Ithaca. And he was involved with a group called Ananda Marga, which is a sort of a neo-Hindu group, which at first didn't really appeal to me. But he was very nice. And we got an apartment together. Then we eventually... I got involved with this group, and we then took this 6-week trip across America in 1978, stopping at various spiritual communes across the country. That's the second chapter of the book actually narrates that. And I guess in the back of my mind, I was like looking for a community, even though I didn't think I'd find it on that trip, but still, and they were all different kinds of communities. And there's quite a variety of places, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't think about this when I was reading the book until now, mm-hmm. but Kevin is someone you guys brought along. You guys put out a posting for somebody to join you.
To share in the expenses.
Yeah, cut down the cost. And a guy, Kevin, from Ithaca, joined you guys. Mm-hmm. And he really had nothing to do with the spirituality. Right. And Ananda was like halfway there, it seems like, and he resonated with it. He respected it, but he wasn't as into it as you were, and he wasn't into the communal monastic path. Mm-hmm. But he was open-minded to an extent, and then Kevin took him the other way mm-hmm. throughout this mm-hmm. trip throughout the United States. And I'm thinking now how interesting it is that you mentioned time again, a big part of your dissatisfaction with different communities was that some of the people either, like, you were looking for the community where the people were fully in it with you, where there wasn't people talking about things that are, I'm trying to find the right word, but you wanted people to be in that spiritual mindset with you, to care as much as you did.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like that you were constantly facing some people, most of the community you would resonate with, but always some people that would take away from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the Odyssey throughout the United States.
Yes.
I don't remember every detail because I remember, I was talking to you as I was reading this chapter. I was blown away that you would go to 2 states in one page because you covered so much ground and you have so much to say in this journey.
Mm-hmm.
But you met some you ended up in some interesting communities.
Yes, and it was, I think it was a really, I'm glad I was able to remember it after it was 45 years ago, because I didn't keep a journal. But luckily I have a good memory, and they were all very diverse. In every single community, almost all but one actually, there was a sense of really people living together, like-minded, and caring about what they were doing. And I think the 2 communities, well, actually, one most surprisingly was the Hare Krishnas, because especially in the 70s, these Hare Krishnas were so annoying. They were just like in the bus station, the Port Authority in New York, or the airport with their little books, and they'd be dancing around, and I think, oh God, these are so annoying, these people. But they had this commune, which is still in existence actually, although it's become more of like a guest house, I think. But it was in its pretty early stages when we were there. A couple of hundred of them living in West Virginia, of all places, in the hillbilly country. And they were so welcoming. And especially I spoke with this guy he was from New York, and I think he might have been Jewish actually. And he was just like a normal person who just found his spiritual path in the Hare Krishnas. There was no pressure on us to join them. And for 3 days we were there. They just gave us food, and we just helped a little bit, and we joined them in their morning, 4 a.m, they're chanting Hare Krishna for hours. And we got caught up in it. It's just like, there's this raw energy. It was just really quite captivating. And actually very disappointing was this Taoist community, because, I was practicing Tai Chi at the time, and and there was a very, very well-known Tai Chi master at this commune in Colorado. And he wasn't very welcoming. And the group, there was these mostly Northern Europeans, and they were just somehow, they weren't friendly, and we actually got kicked out of that place because Ananda was deemed as being aggressive. But still, it was and also what was very welcoming. I mentioned this Christian, like a New Age Christian community in Boulder, Colorado, where they're just, welcome. We just came off the street. We said, "Can we just spend the night here?" So of course, and you just spent the night there. In the morning, everyone gathered together and just held hands and just gave basically non-denominational prayers, and it was just so beautiful. That these people, they also did not try to convert us, as Ananda feared. And basically, stopping in these communes, you see the best in people, I thought, and in most cases. And it just sort of stimulated me to hopefully find some kind of spiritual community for myself that I would feel comfortable in. And that took decades until I actually explored that further.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It was very captivating reading about each community and each experience, especially you were in your early 20s?
I was 24.
What? So my
yes,
age,
your age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To imagine myself doing something like that, it's incredible at that age to really have that, to care that much about your goal and to really go after it from that young of an age. So speaking of that Taoist community, I laughed. That Tai Chi master, he opened up the floor to you guys, and Ananda had some questions.
Yes.
And he didn't like his questions.
Right.
And in return to him following up, he just let out a big fart.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, there was some kind of teaching, Chinese master teaching, where it's called like some kind of like fire teaching, sort of like to jolt you. And I was thinking, that's his teaching. But this fart was so loud, and no one, the Taoist community that was there, no one reacted. We thought this, and he kept on doing it. It wasn't just one time. And this is like 5 a.m, and he's like, and he wouldn't respond anymore to Ananda's question. That was his response, was the fart.
Wow.
And then a couple of hours later, we got the message that he wants us to leave.
Yeah.
He thought, and I thought Ananda's question was fine. There was nothing really aggressive. But Ananda did have these very intense eyes. Mm-hmm. And he said he looked psychotic. That's what this master said. That's how he interpreted. Ananda was very New York intellectual type, and he had these big eyes, and he was very intense. And I think that's how he interpreted it, because these people residing there, these Northern Europeans, were very mellow. And Ananda was not mellow. No. He was not a mellow person. And so I think that was the interpretation. And I recall, I didn't put that in the book though, that we were up in the mountains of northern New Mexico. It was really stunningly beautiful, but I never expected New Mexico to be mountainous and very green. And it was just, well, as we were leaving, we got, it was a terrible rainstorm, and we got lost up in those mountains. And, we felt that there was some kind of curse put on us. That's what we thought, because we had a hard time finding our way out of that region to go further south, where we went to eventually to Santa Fe and then further south. But we got lost in the mountains, and we felt that somehow there was an evil spirit chasing us. It was very, very odd, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it was also in Colorado that you met the tarot card reader?
Yes, that was right before. It was the same place. They had a place in town, Manitou Springs. I guess it's near Colorado Springs, I think, a little bit south of Denver. They had a house in town. That's where we went to first, because that was the address that we found in the book that I had, because there was no internet in these days, of course. And this woman who was in the house when we arrived, she made us some tea, and then she also asked us if we wanted it, because she heard we were on a journey, a spiritual journey. Do you want our tarot cards read? And I have had mine read. I'd never had mine read before. I did later on in San Francisco. So I said, I was all up for it. I said, sure, why not? And when she read the cards, she seemed to know what she was doing. I mean, she really was quite experienced at the cards. She pulled out all these very spiritual cards, very powerful cards. But then my destination card was the Empress. And that, I said, well, what does this mean? Because there's this sort of lavishly attired woman, kind of like a princess type. And I said, I don't think that's really my direction. That's not the direction I have in mind. She said, well, it means like the Earth Mother. And so it means you're going to the mundane world. I said, no, I'm not going to the mundane world. I want a spiritual journey. She said, well, yes, but this is where you're going now. And it proved correct.
Yeah, it did, which we'll talk about San Francisco first, but it's going to be proven correct in Europe, which is quite an interesting section of this book. So you went to San Francisco. You guys were going to Ananda's cousin's place?
Ananda's had a cousin living in Oakland.
Oh, okay.
And with his girlfriend. He was an artist. And a nice guy. I'd met him and his girlfriend. They'd been to Ithaca. And that's where we were going to stay with them at first, because obviously we had no place to stay in San Francisco. And we had no money. We arrived, I think I had $30. Like, that's it. That's all I had. And so, but Ananda and I really were not getting along well. And so I had to find a job and a place to live pretty quickly. And I did in San Francisco. And Ananda also found eventually a place in San Francisco as well, because we didn't want to stay in Oakland. Although it was really Oakland, Berkeley. It was in between Oakland and Berkeley. It was nice, but it was kind of it wasn't what we were looking for. We wanted to live in San Francisco, which is a great city, actually. Especially then, in the late 70s when we arrived, October of 1978, the pre-AIDS San Francisco. It was a wild city. It was just... and so beautiful, and just so much, the energy in San Francisco is just phenomenal. Very different than New York.
Yeah, by the way you were describing it really did seem. Yeah. Which I could see why you got into poetry and
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It was in San Francisco that I started writing poetry.
Yeah. And you were living with Norm.
Yes, he was the first place I found a place to live in this sort of shack kind of place. But it was in a great area, right? Very central. And yes, I live at Norm, the saxophone player from the Bronx, very Jewish.
Yeah. Another fellow New York Jew along the
Yes,
way.
exactly. And he really, he was not religious, but he that saxophone, he played with his heart, several hours a day. But yes, that was the first place I lived. And yeah, it was a nice life. I got a job and pretty quickly, and it all fell into place, really. I was very fortunate that I got it so quickly. I got a job in a health food store. I didn't particularly like the health food store, but it was a job. And I got this room in this nice little shack place in a good location. And everything worked fine.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'm interested in bringing up is the saxophone part, because earlier you mentioned that music was a part of, maybe not the spirituality, but the almost like the hitting the soul, for lack of a better way of saying it. And that happens again in Berlin, especially with the jazz scene.
Yes.
So, and you mentioned that Norm, like, he was passionate about the saxophone, and at the time you were really trying to take meditation seriously.
Right. And
you noticed that for Norm, playing the saxophone was like a meditative process. Do you feel like, looking back now and just in general, that for some people that really is just an extremely meditative process?
I think it is, but if we're talking about in a Buddhist sense of somehow developing sort of mindful awareness and trying to delve into the different layers within us, then I think you really can't do that so much with music. I think music is an expression, and maybe you get to obviously it's a nonverbal part, you're using part of your mind, but I don't think it's going to lead to any kind of revelation. It might lead to an ecstatic sense of euphoria, in what we would call, somehow that state of just being so joyful. But it would be spiritual, but I don't think it's going to lead to any kind of self-knowledge. And so in that sense, why it probably is true that as a monastic and any serious spiritual seeker, normally you do not, monastics are not supposed to really listen to music or go to any entertainment, because it sort of takes you away from the internal work of delving into the mind. So I think they really are not similar, but they can be seen as spiritual in the sense that it takes you out of yourself. But I think they're really not parallel paths.
Yeah, I mean, with music and other worldly joys that are just that, worldly joys, do you feel like it's something that in order to really pursue enlightenment or really pursue spirituality to the fullest, you need to separate yourself from those worldly things, or can there be a healthy balance?
Well, I think there are different stages, and of course there are different forms of Buddhism. Generally speaking, if you're a serious spiritual seeker in the Buddhist path, and I think it would work similarly in Jewish and Christian spirituality, you need to renounce some aspect of that worldliness that's going to take you away from that journey. And the distractions, especially the world that we live in now, there are many more distractions than there were even 30, 40 years ago. And you've got to somehow tune that out, because you cannot get the depth if you have your attention going out in all these other directions. However, once you get to be a really advanced practitioner, you can say, and you have really very good concentration, you can somehow, especially in the Tantric Tibetan tradition, you can use all these mundane things and transform them into some kind of spiritual knowledge. But that is something you really cannot do in the beginning. First, you've got to get deep, and once you're deep, then you can basically see everything as there's no real separation between mundane and super mundane. But you cannot start out that way. You have to start out first getting the depth and the concentration of your mind. And that, I think, works in almost all the spiritual traditions that I've been in, including Judaism, a little bit, very little, Christianity, and different forms of Buddhism. Basically, first you've got to get your mind quiet and deep. And whether that's with God or without God, still it's going to be quieting rather than opening up.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, to add some context as to what I'm doing here, when I first decided to do this, I was going about a career transition, and I've had some previous adventures. And Buddhism has been on my radar because I've had my own journey of, and I still am very much having my own journey of trying to find that proper balance and trying to master my mind. And as I was going about this transitionary period, Buddhism came to mind as a way of achieving the best mindfulness that I can reach and learning, really practicing meditation because it's something I've neglected and am still neglecting, truthfully. And yeah, just trying to get into that state. I've done dopamine detoxes, I call it. It's this thing where you'll refrain from listening to music, refrain from TV, video games, any of these types of worldly pleasures, and like completely refrain to the point where you're so understimulated. And then it's kind of a mental reset, gets you back to homeostasis in a way where I was really doing this mostly when I was a college student. And in order to read a textbook chapter or something that's not very stimulating compared to being able to just open up your phone or computer and scroll through social media or something, I felt that for me was very important. People are hyper stimulated nowadays, and I myself felt very overstimulated. And in doing this, you eventually, and I did experience this, although temporary, because I find, it constantly it's a balance for me, but eventually reaching a state of being able to concentrate on homework and on things that are not as stimulating and instantly gratifying. It's different. It's definitely, it's more of a temporary solution. And for me, it was to focus on homework and studying, but it's interesting. There is some parallel there of really renunciating from those things, abstaining from those things in order to get deeper into your mind and then be able to have those things, but in a responsible way and in a way where it's not a distraction. So me coming here, it was a whole mix of thoughts, including that. And Tibetan Buddhism, I didn't do research on what I was going into. I think my idea of Buddhism was just completely based on Zen Buddhism. And I'm still very interested in that. I think I could really benefit from that. I think that's much more what I was just explaining. And with you saying that when you become a master of controlling your mind, then you can introduce, have all the other things. Like in this monastery, there's a lot of instruments, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of, I went to a Zen monastery, and you mentioned your experience in your book too. Here we have red cushions, we have a big golden Buddha statue with colors everywhere and abstract art everywhere. And the Zen, it's completely minimalist. It's the black cushions, like minimal color. They have the Buddha statue, but it's nothing extravagant. It's not like a super eye-catching experience being there. And it's simply just, it's minimalism, it's simplicity, and I think it's that beginning stage of, silencing your mind and beginning to control your mind. So it's interesting being here. I guess I haven't been able to really dive into it, and I think a lot of that is because I didn't go through any of the meditation, and that maybe in my own time I have in some ways, but never in a spiritual type of way. So it is interesting, the different sectors of Buddhism. And when you checked out the Zen monastery in New York City, how would you explain that experience? Because that was you had a little bit of an introduction, but that was the first time you wanted to like consistently go into it, right?
Yeah, that actually was, I would say, over 20 years after I really first opened up to Buddhism. But don't forget, then I went to this detour through Ananda Marga, and I somehow forgot about Buddhism. And then now 20 years had elapsed, nearly 20 years. And then all those years in Europe when I was on and off, vaguely thinking about Buddhism.
Which we will talk about.
Yeah, we'll talk about. And then I already was back in New York about 6 years. I was a graduate student in New York. And I wasn't even aware that I was seeking any kind of spiritual journey because I was in the middle of writing my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation. But as I write in the book, I just found myself, I took a walk one afternoon from the New York Public Library where I was doing my research. And I was in Barnes & Noble, one of the Barnes & Noble stores. And I was just in the Eastern religion section. I just happened to find this book on Western Buddhism. And that opened my mind to Buddhism again. I somehow remembered my interest in it almost 20 years before. And then I was looking to see, well, what kind of places are available in New York, in Buddhism. And I came upon the Zen Center of New York. And most of my interest in Buddhism before Ananda Marga was really Zen oriented. And I had read a lot of the classic works on Zen in the 1970s, works that were around at that time. And so I went there and, it was pretty much as I remembered. You just sit facing a wall and sitting on those black cushions and white, completely bare walls. And, I really liked it at first. And I went several times a week. I would go on Sundays when there would be someone giving a talk. Then the other evenings, just during the week, they'd be just sitting and walking. But I think what turned me off mostly was that I didn't find the people very friendly. Mm-hmm. But then I thought, this is New York. Everyone's in a hurry. No one really is looking to make friends there. They just come and they meditate and they leave. That's basically what it was. And so after a couple of months, I drifted away and I found another aspect of Buddhism, the early tradition of just sitting meditation and a little bit more talking, but still it really wasn't satisfying either. But nevertheless, the Zen, it held me at first for a couple of months, but then I, not so much the practice, but I didn't find the community that I really wanted to actually continue with.
Yeah, that truly sounded like the most New Yorkified version of Buddhism. Even you mentioned that there's a walking meditation practice and that it seemed like, and you're walking in circles, right? But it seemed like everyone was in a rush.
Yes, and maybe that's the way they do it in Zen, because I had some, just in my mind, I thought a walking meditation must be slow because it's supposed to be meditation. And I remember the first time I did it, why is this person right up my back? And I'm walking slowly, I felt someone breathing down my neck.
Which is so New York. I imagine.
I'm in a hurry. Where are you going? We just walk around in circles.
Yeah. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Well, so going back, after you were in San Francisco for 2 years.
2.5 years, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. And during that time, it wasn't about spirituality per se. You were still meditating. And actually, you hosted, what was it, the end?
Yes, he was the teacher who actually, when on our trip, we stopped off in Denver, which was the headquarters of Ananda Marga. And the Acharya, which is sort of he's like a monk, but they don't have monks in this Hindu tradition. He's like a teacher wearing robes, I guess you could say, a celibate teacher wearing robes. He was the one who received me into Ananda Marga. He came to San Francisco for a visit, and he had no place to stay, and so I put him up with Norman, agreed. And he stayed with us for a few days, which was wonderful. And I remember seeing him and thinking, well, he's sort of like a monk. I wish maybe I could be sort of like him. And then, it was very nice. I found out a few months later, though, that he left and got married. So there went that, idea. But I really wasn't, I distanced myself from Ananda Marga when I got a job in this health food store, like a natural food store. I wouldn't call it a health food store. The original one I really didn't like. It was a little bit too, it was downtown San Francisco near Union Square, and it didn't have the atmosphere I was looking for. It wasn't a neighborhood store. It was just a busy downtown store. but I found a job after much persistence on a really nice, friendly atmosphere, Nob Hill, near Polk Street. And it was run by two gay men who weren't together. But everyone working there in this store, it was just like a family. It was just such a nice atmosphere. And that's where I really worked for really almost 2 years, actually. And it was during that time that I started writing poetry, because one of the Christmas gatherings, one of my coworkers gave me a journal. She said, well, maybe this will stimulate you to write something. I said, how'd you know I wanted to write? And so she was very insightful. And so I started writing in a journal, then I started writing poetry. And also at the same time, I was also introduced from some of my colleagues at this store into new wave music. And San Francisco was like a hub of punk and new wave music in the late 70s. And there we get to music again, and dancing became my spiritual practice. I just realized I just like to dance. And this music was just so, if anyone's familiar with, new wave music, it has a real driving rhythm. Very, very, and you cannot stand still when this music is playing. And so, I started getting into really dancing at these new wave clubs.
And at that point, you weren't meditating much?
No, very little. I tried to, but it was falling to the side. I sometimes would just go and I would still take walks. There's some really beautiful places in San Francisco to go near the bay, and also across the bay in Marin County. There was like headlands there. It was like a nature preserve, and I would go there and just sit and just enjoy the beauty and the silence. And so I did that as well, and as well as going to these new wave clubs as well. So I had this sort of this two directions.
Yeah. Well, so then at the end of San Francisco, you felt like you were ready for a change.
Yes.
And you were thinking maybe another city in America, but instead you felt like it was time to go to Europe. Yes.
I couldn't find a place in America that really grabbed me. I didn't want to come back to New York, and I thought of Boston for a while. But then somehow I'd become very interested in German Expressionism through a really very good exhibition that was in San Francisco at the time, and reading some of the literature. And I decided, I think I'm just going to go to Europe. And I chose Berlin. Not a popular choice from my mother's point of view, because we didn't have the Jewish background. That was certainly not her first choice. But again, I never really listened to my parents, because I don't know. I just somehow I was driven. I was fascinated by Berlin. I was fascinated by the culture of the 1920s, what's called the Weimar Republic, because after the First World War, between the First World War and Hitler, there was this interim period, and it was a republic. And, the monarchy was finished, and there was this republic. And there was just all this energy in Berlin. And even though economically it was very poor from the war, but there was all this avant-garde culture in Berlin. And it was known for notorious nightlife there, and artists and writers and lots of drugs. I mean, everything was in Berlin at that time. And so that was my initial impetus to go, and it was pretty daring. I had, again, not very much money, and I bought a one-way ticket and didn't know anybody there. And I went in 1981.
Was it during that time period that the Scream painting was made?
No, the Scream painting was made at late 19th century.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because it was interesting. You, at one point, were reflecting on when you saw that painting.
Yes, a few years later, yeah.
And you felt it in a sense that you felt the scream to get out of what you called the oppressive normalcy. I believe that was the
the bourgeois normalcy. Yes. That, and I think that was the purpose of the original art. It's a very famous painting, Edvard Munch, Norwegian artist. And I think late 19th century Norwegian bourgeois society, he was rebelling against, because his painting is very powerful. And when I got the chance to view it, actually the actual painting in Oslo, the museum, and it's a little painting, which is always like the Mona Lisa. It's so small, but it's very powerful. And yes, and it was sensing that this little figure in this painting is just letting out all this frustration. And I suppose I was able to understand and relate to this figure, that I too had all this frustration, even my life or whatever, that I could not. I somehow was still always rebelling against normalcy, or conventional normalcy. And I was living in Stuttgart at the time, Stuttgart, Germany. And Stuttgart was the opposite of Berlin. But I again, it was sort of a long story how I got a job there, but I got a teaching position there, teaching English as a foreign language in Stuttgart for 2 years in an American institute. So that's what brought me to Stuttgart, even though I normally would never have chosen Stuttgart. But it was while living there that I went to Oslo on this trip. I was taken along there on this trip by the lieutenant governor of the state. It was really quite an interesting trip. And I saw this painting. And so I always disliked Stuttgart because it was such a place that just celebrated normalcy. And it was a very unexciting city, and but fairly affluent. And so that painting somehow just reminded me that it was part of me that just really rebelled against that.
Yeah, was that part of you? Did you feel pressure? Did you feel like you were getting pressure externally to be boxed into a normal life, work a normal job, settle down, and not the religious component? Or do you feel like you weren't restricted too much in that regard?
No, I really wasn't, except, the students I was teaching, because I was teaching English to adults, it wasn't to children. I had a number of classes with business people. And so teaching business people, which of course I had no real experience with, I was never really a businessman, they led a really boring normal life, because you're teaching English, and some of them had at least intermediate level, so you can hold some kind of conversation. So I would always get these questions and try to get them to speak about themselves, about their life, their daily life, and what they do. And they really had nothing interesting to say. And I realized, wow, these people, I can't really relate to them, because I had already, at this point, I had spent 2 years in West Berlin. I was in London. I had been in Barcelona. I'd been all over these places. I've been in San Francisco. I'm from New York. I had a lot of experiences already. And these people had nothing to talk about. And so we would have these classes. I was pulling teeth to try to get them to say something. Well, what did you do yesterday? And they said, I got up, I had coffee, I went to work. What did you do the next day before that? I got up, I had coffee. I said, okay, what are you going to do on the weekend? Well, I'm going to get up and have coffee, go for a walk. I don't know.
Creatures of habit.
Yeah.
So you were living a very different life.
Yes.
When you first went to Berlin, it was a matter of just as far as working, get a job that'll just pay for whatever you need, bare minimum pretty much.
Yes.
And then eventually you made some friends there, including George, who you talk a decent amount about. I guess with George, he really was a very significant part of the Berlin chapter.
The Berlin chapter. I spent a total of 2 years at first, then I left for a few years, and I came back again for 6 more years. George was especially a good part of it, an important person. He's, I went to Europe with this, despite looking for this Weimar Berlin of the 1920s. I had this romantic image of Europe, of having some kind of aesthetic culture, atmosphere that America did not have. And so I was looking for something that just brought back some kind of substance. And George was this Viennese waiter in a coffee house in Berlin's really only traditional coffee house, although it was not traditional really in many ways. And I had never met anyone like him before. He was something really out of the former century, the 19th century, or at least the turn of the century. The way he carried himself, and the way he waited on the tables, and the way his appearance was, I was really quite fascinated. And although I was becoming disillusioned with Berlin because it was not meeting my expectations of somehow the European atmosphere I was expecting. Because Berlin, first of all, besides being badly bombed in the war, it really wasn't so much that, because there was still, surprisingly, a lot of the old Berlin left because it was such a big city, and the various neighborhoods were many of them were untouched from bombing. And so you got a sense of pre-war Berlin, certainly the neighborhoods I lived in, with the dim gas lights and the cobblestone streets and the really it was pretty much a forlorn city, because there was no money invested in it after the war, because no one knew what was going to happen to West Berlin. So it was kind of a decaying city, which I kind of liked. Very gray, incredibly gray. And that had atmosphere for a while, but somehow I didn't sense what I was looking for. And I thought I was going to go to Vienna, actually, because Vienna is really a city that seems to dwell in the past. And George talked me out of it. He said, no, you don't want to go to Vienna. Berlin's got the nightlife that only Berlin has. And so I started exploring the Berlin nightlife, which runs 24 hours a day. It never closes. These bars and cafes are open all night. And so that was, George was someone that I developed a interesting friendship with. And but I also saw another side to the old Europe that I was not aware of before, because there was sort of a decadence and a sort of a self-destruction. And George had this in him. He was, we would stay out, we would first go out at midnight or 1 a.m, because he was working. And people didn't really go out in Berlin until midnight anyway. And everything just ran all night. So the peak was like 4 or 5 a.m. And, and you stay out all night in these various places we went to. And George was like drinking. I never saw anyone drink as much as George. And he was a fairly small person. And he wasn't drinking beer or wine. He was drinking cognac. And huge quantities of cognac every night, and smoking incessantly. And I just thought that, this is somewhat self-destructive, to be doing this to yourself. And he didn't eat well. He never really was out during the day. He was only out at night, because then he would sleep during the day, obviously. And it was an interesting experience. And I didn't mention so much in the book, because I couldn't really go into so many details. But I had another friend who was like a counterpart to George, who was British. And I spent a lot of time with him as well. And we would go out on the nights I wasn't with George, and we would just go to normal cafes and just hang out and talk. And he was a very eloquent, though not highly educated, but I always found the British to be so articulate, and he had very sharp wit, which the British also could have. And so I enjoyed spending time with him too. And so that was the other aspect. And what we would do is, with him and other expatriates, we had like a little community we developed of other, mostly British. I really wasn't looking for Americans. I was more happy with the British, actually. And we would just sit around and we would just bash the Germans. We would just like tear them apart, how ridiculous they were, and how, the silly things that they would do. And, because we were all struggling to get by with these menial jobs. Like I ended up working in a hotel, and then I left it because I went to Paris just for an adventure, and I quit my job. And I came back, I couldn't get a job, and I ended up washing dishes in different places. And I actually ended up washing dishes in the coffee house where George was working, but then I accidentally blew up the stove, and so I lost my job. But they said, you can still drink your coffee here, but you can't work in the kitchen. So yeah, it was a hard life, and I had really no money. I remember one time, for some reason, I was down to 50 German marks, which was like maybe $25. And I had to pay my rent in a couple of days. And I figured, now, how am I going to pay my rent? I had like a furnished room. And so George said, why don't you go to the casino? I said, casino? I only have 25 marks. He said, well, try it. And so I said, all right. So I took my last money. I went to a casino, which they had in Berlin. And I ended up making like 500 marks.
Wow.
And all I was playing, the roulette wheel, black and red, because I didn't do blackjack or anything. And I just had this incredible luck. I just kept on winning, and people were like looking at me like, how could you I'm just guessing black or red. And I ended up, and I had enough money. I paid the rent. I gave George some money. it was just like amazing how that happened.
Wow. Did that bring you into doing it more? Or
No.
It was
No.
one time.
I knew it was a dangerous habit.
Yeah.
And it was something I did because I was desperate. I figured,
Mhm.
how am I going to come up with this money? And I said, all right, I'll try. I'll go to the casino.
Yeah, that often can lead people down a bad path.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
Very, very bad habit. I would no. And I was never really, and I didn't like the atmosphere of it. I didn't like the people that were there and the drinking and just the noise and the colors and I didn't like it at all. But it worked, it helped me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That it did. You were saying before, I mean, George took you around. He really brought you into the nightlife.
Yes.
He was quite the character, and he was connected with all these people. And he dwelled in the night. All the while, as you mentioned before, there was that dark side of him. And at one point, you mentioned later on that there was a night he was drinking and then smashing the bottle against the counter. Smashing glasses, wow. And then asking for another one.
Yeah.
And you approached him, and he told you he was trying to kill a part of himself.
Yes.
And you became really, although you were just a friend coming along for his wild adventure, you were also this compassionate person that was looking after him and spending the night just to make sure he was all right.
Mm-hmm.
So when you really first saw that self-destructive nature, I mean, how did that change your perspective about George, and how did it make you feel as far as, I guess, connecting it to that spiritual aspect? Because you mentioned compassion is such a major part of Buddhism.
Yeah.
How would you connect that to your...
Well, I don't think I was thinking Buddhism at this point. This is really the first part of my stay in Berlin, my first 2 years, really, during this, that I experienced this with him. It made me feel that I realized that most people he was interacting with did not see that underneath this facade that he presented of being this turn of the century Viennese gentleman, the way he dressed, and with the tuxedo, he wore the tuxedo even at night, and then the black leather gloves he held in his hands, and the hat he wore, and that he used the umbrella like a walking stick, and the eyeliner that he put on, his black eyeliner. He presented himself in this way that people really didn't see that beneath that, there was someone who was really just somehow drowning. Mm-hmm. And so that brought out to me, and I realized that he's sort of like a helpless person. And I felt that protectiveness because I realized I'm seeing something most people are not seeing. And so I felt compelled to be there, although I began to not really enjoy the nightlife at all because I really don't drink. And I certainly wasn't smoking anymore. And there was, people were passing joints around, but I really wasn't interested in that. I did start smoking cigarettes because I was bored and someone offered me a cigarette. I said, all right. And I realized, okay, give me something to do. And I'm breathing it in anyway, so I might as well smoke. And I would get so tired, by 5, 6 in the morning, I couldn't take it. I would just leave him at some point. That I couldn't make it all the way through the night. Although sometimes I did stay quite late, but then eventually I got to the point. Everything really has a purpose. I've seen throughout my journey that some of the decisions I made are because the causes and conditions came up, and that's very Buddhist to look at that. That even the decisions I make are based on the causes and conditions. And at some point, I took this trip to Prague during this time. Just I felt like getting away for a weekend. And don't forget, this is still in the early 1980s. We're talking about, we're in the middle of the Cold War still. And Prague is in Czechoslovakia, which was obviously a communist country. So it was kind of exciting to go there alone for a weekend in the middle of winter. I went to Prague, and it was just such an amazing experience just being there because it's an outstandingly beautiful city, one of the few cities in Central Europe that were not bombed at all in the war, strangely enough. So it's completely intact. And the atmosphere, and just still in that communist era, there were hardly any tourists there. So I was roaming around. And it gave me this sort of adventurous spirit. I came back to Berlin, and during that time, George lost his job because I was normally calling him every day to wake him up. Because, he would go to bed maybe at 10, 11 in the morning, and he would sleep, and then he'd have to be at work at 4 in the afternoon. And so I had a cleaning job at a bar, and I would just I would put the phone on with loud music playing, and I would just leave it sitting there, and I would go around cleaning because I couldn't wait for him to pick up the phone. It'd take him sometimes an hour to hear the phone. So of course I wasn't there for the weekend, so I wasn't there to call him. So he lost his job, and then he eventually got a job at the same place where I was cleaning, and then I felt sorry for him, so I started helping him in the evenings while he was waiting there, just to make sure that he would keep that job. And so besides cleaning, I was also helping without getting paid for it. I would just help them, and I would start washing the dishes. I'd get a head start on it. And then somehow the people there who, they were very friendly, but they said I really wasn't cleaning well, because I guess I wasn't putting that much effort into it. And they said that, so I lost my cleaning job. And then I was just at this point, I really thought that maybe I needed a change. I'd been in Berlin for 2 years, and now I lost a job. I really had zero money. And so I thought this English friend suggested I go to London to get a qualification to teach English as a foreign language. And I thought I needed a break from Berlin. And so I left after 2 years, left George. And I really felt almost like I needed to just be free. And I had seen myself as an expatriate writer. I'd started, I was really writing on and off during the time in Berlin as well. When I wasn't with George, I was writing. I was sitting in cafes. I was definitely a cafe sitter, my cigarettes and coffee and writing. And when I went to London, though, being in an English-speaking country, it just catapulted me into writing, because the atmosphere was just so conducive. And I had a few friends that I had known from Berlin who were English friends, and it was a wonderful time, even though, again, I had no money, and I got a job, in a kitchen in a restaurant, illegal work in London, because I didn't have a work permit. But I didn't mind, it was a pretty hard job, but I did it, and I did this training course, and I stayed the full 6 months I was permitted to stay as an American in England. It was wonderful. And I forgot all about Berlin, in a way, and I was not in a hurry to go back there.
Yeah, I took notes on the writing part.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned, it seemed that you were consistently, and I don't even think it was intentional, but it just kept happening, writing about these characters that were stuck in that super mundane existence.
Yeah.
And even though it wasn't this religious longing yet, you felt that, even though, you were on an exciting adventure, you were constantly getting change, which I think you really wanted, but still, maybe those few years weren't really doing it for you, and that was your expression of it.
I think, in London, something got triggered, and I think it was also, I spent a lot of time just walking around London. Very inspiring, just being in a big city again. It was, it has some similarities to New York, but in some ways it was just more welcome. It was an easier city to deal with than New York. And although it had a lot of the same, energy, and there a lot of street life in London, and you see a lot of down and out people, and but there was also sort of a character, because London is such an old city, and it has, and so much literature has taken place in London. I was thinking of Charles Dickens and all these places. I said, wow, London's just breathing atmosphere. And so it was very inspiring, much more so than New York, actually. And so I would write these stories. I started writing stories rather than poetry. I wrote poetry as well, but I started writing stories. I found a cafe that was just very conducive for just sitting for a couple of hours with a cup of coffee, and nobody bothered you. Just sit there, and there's a nice atmosphere, really beautiful atmosphere. And I started writing a story about characters who would have some kind of experience, at least not all of them, but some of them, of breaking out of that mundane life. And I think that was, again, without knowing exactly what it was that they experienced, but there was something that I was still, somewhere within me was still playing out, that I was looking for something beyond the everyday.
Mm.
And I had these characters discover things in these stories, some of the stories that I wrote at that time. And that continued actually in, I had to leave London. Obviously, I couldn't stay after 6 months. And I really was sorry to go, but, there was no way for me really to stay. And so I at a friend's suggestion, I went to Barcelona because, again, I had like £200, which was like, $300. That's all I had really to go to another place. And they said, well, Barcelona, might won't be that expensive, and it's an interesting city, and it's near the sea, and it's warmer than, London in the winter is pretty miserable, actually. And so I went to Barcelona. That was a really adventure to go there. I didn't know anyone. I could barely speak Spanish. And so little money. I remember the friends I stayed with were so nice in London. They gave me the keys to their apartment. They said, look, if you get stuck and you need to come back to London and we're not here, you can come into the apartment.
Wow, that's so nice.
Would you believe that?
That is so
Because they were worried about me. I was going there with so little money. And but I'm a survivor. I really...
Yeah. You've really been through quite the conditions.
Yeah.
So after a few years, you were also in one other city, right? I think it was in Germany.
Yes, but then I was in Barcelona for 6 months. In some ways, I regret not staying there longer, but it was just so hard for me to make it there because, again, Americans don't have legal, we're not in the European community, so we don't have work permits for Spain. And so I got a job at Berlitz, a international network of language schools, and they somehow had some political connections. They got a work permit, but you could only work at Berlitz. And they paid terribly, really badly. And they occupied all your hours. That means you had to be available to teach in the evenings, which is when most of the classes were. So I couldn't find any other supplementary work. And I was like, they said, well, we'll give you an advance because I was running out of money. So once I got that advance, I never caught up. I was constantly in the minus level. And after 6 months, I figured, this is so frustrating. It's just so hard to survive here. And I was dealing with 2 foreign languages because in Barcelona they were speaking Catalan, which is a completely different language from Castilian Spanish. And then I thought, somehow, believe it or not, I was beginning to miss Germany because I was able to at least converse in German to some extent. And it was, there were some things about Germany that were very orderly and, things were functioning well. In Spain, it's not like that. And there was a job advertised in the International Herald Tribune for Stuttgart, an American institute. They were looking for someone, and they offered a 2-year contract. I said, well, let me try. Mm-hmm. And I went there for an interview, and they gave me the job. And so I moved back to Germany, and I just remembered something, I think it was in the book. What stimulated me to go to Germany is that it was music again. Mm. There was a very famous orchestra from Leipzig, which was still East Germany at this time. They were coming to Barcelona to give a concert. And, I remembered when I was in Berlin, I used to go to the Philharmonic Hall, because Berlin Philharmonic is one of the world's great orchestras. And so I used to go, when I was in Berlin the first time, I would go to concerts, classical concerts. And here I was in Barcelona, and this famous orchestra from Leipzig, again, almost up there with the Berlin Philharmonic, they were coming to Barcelona. They were going to give a concert. I said, I think I want to go. So I went with a colleague. We went to this concert. It was Brahms. And I never really heard Brahms before, but it was so brilliantly played by this really very, very good orchestra. I said, wow, Germans. That was one thing I really liked about the Germans was their music. Yeah. Things I didn't like about them, okay, but the music is one thing they were very good at. And all the great composers, a lot of them are German. And so then I got that little inkling, and then as I got this mood, that's when I found this job offer. Mm. And so it all came together.
And then after that, you ended up back in Berlin.
Yes, I stayed in Stuttgart for 2 years. I had a contract for 2 years. They wanted to renew it. I said, no, I had enough for Stuttgart. Mm-hmm. 2 years, thank you very much. Yeah. I was actually, at this time, I was thinking of coming back to America. Mm. I really wasn't going to go to Berlin. I was going to come back to America. I wanted to go to graduate school, thinking. But I hadn't really planned it out, and I came back to New York. Actually, I spent a summer in New York, 1986. I didn't put that in the book, though. But I felt I really could not connect to New York or America. I'd been gone for 5 years, and I saw how expensive graduate school was, and I thought, this is not realistic at all. And 1986 in America was the middle of the Reagan years. It was really a world that I really wasn't familiar with, because I left in 1981. And somehow New York was I just didn't think that I could really live here. And so at this time, George had opened up this bar in Berlin, in West Berlin. And he said, oh, come back to Berlin and help me run this bar. And I thought, all right, I'll come back to Berlin. I'll help him run this bar and join the night world, but as someone working in it. And so I moved back to West Berlin in 1986. And George had opened this really beautiful place. He found someone to back the money because George had nothing. And it was a very stylish place. And he wanted it to be more like a piano bar. Like on the weekend, there'd be like a pianist and a singer. But during the week, it was just like a bar, very expensive. The door was closed, locked. It only opened for people, like a club. He wanted like a club. But after a year, I said, this place was not taken, because Berlin is not that kind of city. And so I pushed him I said, look, we have to open up the music. Why don't we make it as a jazz bar and see if we can get a program? And so George said, well, you have to organize it. I said, okay, I'll organize it. Because, George is not good at things like that. He only is good with talking to people. It's okay. We put some ads in the newspaper and magazines and started auditioning musicians. Also, these musicians streaming into the place. In Berlin, and a lot of musicians. And there were surprisingly some Americans, some Black American musicians from New York. Very high quality musicians who happened to be living in Berlin. And so we developed, it became a jazz bar. And we had music from 11 at night till 4 in the morning, which is very unusual even in Berlin. It's this very small place, but it just took off. And in a very brief time. And, we had 40 to 50 musicians, and we had vocalists also on the weekends. And I took care of all the program and dealt with all the musicians. George didn't even know their names half the time. So I had to introduce them each during the sets, I'd be waiting the tables, and I'd have to run and go to the little stage we had and introduce the musicians, because George didn't know their names. But it was really quite exciting, actually. And it was a great success story for the brief time that it operated.
Yeah, you guys were even mentioned in the New York Times. Right?
Yes, and the New York Times did and this was actually even before the jazz program started. The New York Times, they were doing it in the Sunday travel section. They were doing a section on the Berlin nightlife, and they came to our bar. And this was while it was still just a piano bar. It really wasn't a jazz bar yet. And there was a whole big, whole column in the New York Times. George was so proud of that one column. He put a scrapbook together of all the publicity. But that New York Times column to him, that reached the peak.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you guys had a lot of success until it was a tenant upstairs had a noise complaint.
Yes, because when they built, they took over this bar and they made this beautiful bar. It was very small, and they did not want to take away from the size by making the sound insulation thicker than they should have done, because there were apartments upstairs. It was like a tenement building. This was on the ground floor, which was pretty typical in Berlin. And here we are. We had music all night, and the sound insulation was not really that good. And so this tenant started making trouble, and the police came a couple of times. And one time, they kept on saying, they warned us. They said, you can't have music all night. You have to stop at 11 o'clock. And of course, that's where we started. And so one night, I remember this was just there we are. It was on a weeknight, actually. And the singer was singing. We had a singer that night. And she was singing, and the trio was playing. And the place was fairly full. And the police come walking in. And they were really nice. They let her finish the song. I thought it was really quite nice of them. Actually, and I could see this. She was so nervous because she's singing. The police officer was standing right.
She's got new audience.
She this audience. The police officer was standing right in front of her, and so she finished her song, and then they said, "Okay, you have to stop the music," and that was it. And that then began the end of this Cafe Bar Schiller, And it was a very slow, painful death because George wanted to keep it open, hoping that somebody will come forward with some money to let us move to another place, support us. And of course, no one did. And it just people started coming. And I was there mostly alone a lot of the time because George would drink up all the alcohol that we had left, which was very little. And so, it ended, it began to lead to what would be my exit from Berlin eventually.
Yeah, before that, and I do think just wild that you would casually go into East Berlin and back, and bring in alcohol and not worry about the border.
Yes, at this time, because Berlin was so strangely, West Berlin was in the middle of East Germany, and you had East Berlin, which is the other half of the city. But there was a way that you could take the subway to a station in East Berlin. It was like a transfer point to another subway stop. And on this platform, because you really were in East Berlin, they had these little, they're like duty-free shops, but they weren't a shop. It was more like just a stall. And so you could actually get these like duty-free alcohol and cigarettes without actually passing through the border check into East Berlin. But you're really in East Berlin, but it was like a transfer point. And so to make it really daring, because I was, again, never had any money, and there was an honor system in Berlin on the transportation system, I never bought a ticket. And so I would go late in the evening with be lesser chance of anybody checking tickets. And I would go like 11 o'clock at night. I would go on the train, the subway, and go to East Berlin, buy some alcohol, buy some cartons of cigarettes, hop on the train, and come back into Berlin, West Berlin, without having a ticket. It was really kind of, it was an adventure.
Yeah.
And I would do this in the early days when before we became the jazz bar, we really had so little money to buy stuff. So I was doing that. Yeah.
Well, so very soon after the collapse of the jazz bar, almost symbolically, was the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Yeah.
Yes, which was an amazing time that I happened to get to live through it.
Yeah, to be there for that.
I was there and I watched it slowly build to that point. And, that 1989 was really, this was November of 89 when the wall first opened. But leading up to it, there was a lot of tension in the whole Eastern Bloc as more and more people began to realize that, the West has so much material stuff that we don't have. And East Germans particularly, who were fairly well off, comparatively speaking, compared to the other Eastern Bloc countries, they really knew what was going on in the West because they were able to get like West German television stations, even though they weren't supposed to be watching them. But in Berlin, it was pretty hard to control. And so there started these demonstrations. They were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I remember just days before this happened, there were maybe 500,000 people in East Berlin demonstrating. And so the government was getting a little bit nervous. So the old party person who built the wall, he'd stepped down, and they were trying to calm things down a little bit. And then they realized that, they're going to have to do something to please the people. So there I was with George, and I was sitting in a cafe in West Berlin. And this French woman, who he happened to know, came up to her and said, I heard that the Berlin Wall opened and people were screaming into Berlin. We think, what are you talking about? How could that be happening? Her German probably wasn't very good. You probably misunderstood. And so I went home that night. I happened to live in this working class neighborhood, not far from the wall. And I happened to notice all these little East German cars around. I said, why are you, late at night, why are these East German cars? And these people window shopping in a really working class neighborhood. This is very odd. It's 1 a.m. And I went home and I put on the radio, the BBC World Service is what I always listen to. And they were just the announcer was not being very British at all. He was he couldn't control himself. He said, you can't imagine what happened. The Berlin Wall is open and thousands of people are streaming into West Berlin in the middle of the night. So I thought, this is just unbelievable. And what happened, apparently, which was so amazing, was a misunderstanding that the East German Minister of Travel had announced that, okay, East Germans are going to be allowed now to travel to the West. But he didn't mean at that moment, And so people, of course, rumors spread, and people just by the thousands in East Berlin started just running to the border. And the police didn't know what to do. There were all these thousands of people who just showed up in the middle of the night. So they said, they just opened the gate and let them out.
Wow.
And then people were just like started streaming into West Berlin. It was just really quite amazing. I mean, obviously just for a visit, they still went back, but that began then what turned out to be would be the fall of the wall. It took, it went through a period of time, and it was a very interesting period to live through, and to see the change. And being a Berlin resident, I had opportunities to go to East Berlin during the transition period, which was about a year before they actually unified the two Germanys. And you still had East Germany over there with the East German money and everything. But I got to go. I traveled to East Germany a lot, actually, during that year. Went to all these different places, and Dresden and Leipzig and all these places. That it was exciting. And then, but then, I decided I wanted to go back to school and study graduate English literature. And after studying in Berlin for a couple of years, I realized, okay, now it's time. My 11-year exile is over. Time to come back.
Yeah, and to think that this is we're mainly focusing, at least with the book, on the monastic spiritual journey, but you have a PhD. That is such a big deal.
Yeah. I came back to New York, back to my home city. I went to the City University. First, I went to Queens College, got a master's degree, and then the City University Graduate School and got the PhD. And and I did it pretty quickly because I didn't begin until I was close to 40, which is late, to begin a doctoral program. So I was very inspired to go quickly. And so I went through the program pretty fast and got my PhD in English literature, specializing in the medieval period. And during that time is when I reconnected with Buddhism during those graduate school years.
That's when you found Zen, right?
That's when I found Zen, exactly.
Yeah, and then you got the dream job, right? Which college was it that you
my first job actually was a very good job. Actually, it was in Alabama.
Oh, or that was the first one. Yeah, you were in Alabama first.
But, it was really a good position. It was a very light teaching load. The students were rather docile and respectful. They even called me sir.
Wow.
Yes, they were very respectful.
There's a lot of respect in the South.
There's a lot of respect, but they didn't think I was American, though. They said, you speak funny. Where are you from?
Well, everywhere.
Well, yeah, exactly. I said, I'm from New York. I said, aren't you English? I said, no, I'm from New York. I said, you speak English in a different way. So, but I couldn't understand some of my students. I was a bit of a problem. But, I taught University of South Alabama at Mobile for 4 years. But what stimulated me to leave, or want to leave, is that I couldn't find a group of Buddhist practitioners. And I tried with my colleague to form a group, but there just was no interest. And so that really why I desperately went on the job market again, looking for a job. And it's very difficult to get what they call a tenure track position, like a full-time tenure track position in English literature. It's difficult. And but then some very interesting circumstances occurred. Again, I think causes and conditions being really amazing, that I was offered a job. I was ready to give up. I was offered a job at the City University of New York, and I was able to move back to New York 2004. And that's when I actually got involved with Tibetan Buddhism. I thought, let me try something different.
Yeah, and you mentioned your parents were extremely proud at this point, right?
Yes, my parents. First of all, I moved back to New York. I mean,
that was
they were actually living in New Jersey in a retirement community, but they're native New Yorkers, and there I was. I eventually, after living in the Bronx for a little while in Riverdale, where my cousin lived, at first I decided I wanted to move to Manhattan, and I got this. I scraped together just barely enough money to buy a very small studio apartment on the Upper West Side, Riverside Drive, in a dormant building, very tiny, but still, it's the Upper West Side. Yeah. My parents were just like, when they came to see the apartment, said, well, it's small, but it's in Manhattan, it's right across from the Hudson River, and it's like, wow, they were just so excited. Here I am as a professor in my little apartment in Manhattan, I finally got it together.
Until
yes, and then
and not that you didn't have it together after, but
no,
to their expectations.
The expectations, because as I was involved in Tibetan Buddhism, and in the chapter there are different types of Tibetan Buddhism. I won't go into that, but I got more and more into it, and I eventually that monastic urge sort of came back. And because I met some Western monastics and Tibetan monastics, and they told me about this monastery in France, which was an international monastery, and I went there and I visited. I spent my winter break there from university, and then I went there in the summer and spent a lot of time there. I said, "Oh wow, here we are as a monastery, and there are all these international, monks from all different countries." And I said, "Wow, this is what I'm looking for." And so, I'm already 54, why wait? And one of them cautioned me, who was in his 60s actually. He said, don't wait too long. It's very difficult, the longer you wait, to make a move like this. And so I I made a trip to Nepal actually, and I stayed at a monastery there, and I bought my robes, and I said, okay, when I'm ready, I'll have the robes. And I spoke with the abbot of this monastery, and I asked him for his advice. I said, I really have this urge to ordain, but my parents are very elderly now, and I think it would kill them for me to do this, because I got this, I'm finally settled in my job. And he said, well, you have to do what you feel is you're called to do. And if you wait too long, you might lose the urge to ordain. And it's very helpful to do it. He said, your parents probably want what's best for you, want you to be happy, and they'll probably come along. They'll accept it. That's what he said. So I said, well, he's very wise. I'm just going to listen to him. And so I followed that, and I came back to New York, and I put my apartment up for sale, and I had nearly 2,000 books I had to somehow disperse. And I did it. And it was very easy. It was just the easiest thing to do. I just felt that, wow, the renunciation was just so strong that I didn't care. I mean, I'm living in New York. I liked it, but, I wanted to devote myself full time to the spiritual journey, my spiritual path. And what I found was happening, because I would be spending so much time going to retreats and weekend workshops and different things. I was not putting a lot of effort into teaching. Mm-hmm. And I was just, I was at John Jay College, where I was teaching. I taught a lot of the same courses over again. It was a survey of literature, of classical literature, actually. And I was teaching it so many times that I didn't have to prepare at all. I just basically, I didn't try to make it different. I just kept on doing the same stuff over and over again. No preparation. And I thought, well, I don't think I'm really giving my full effort to my teaching, because I can't do both. And the spiritual path really won. And so I had to make that decision, and I did. And so I left at the end of 2007 and went to India, and had the good fortune of ordaining with His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Mm-hmm. Which is huge. I mean, I was going to say, I had very little knowledge about Buddhism before this, but I think everybody who listens to this will know the name, the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
And that's so significant for that to be the way you're brought into it.
Yes. And it was just I remember so clearly that wonderful experience of, we had to go through a training first. We spent a month in Dharamsala, which is in the foothills of the Himalaya. In the middle of winter, it was, very harsh living conditions. And, again, already I was in my 50s, and somehow I managed to get through it, because we had a little group of Westerners who were going through this, because we were just so excited and motivated by this opportunity we had to be ordained by His Holiness. And it was wonderful. I remember just the night after the ordination, we stayed up all night just doing all these chantings. Mm. We had the celebration.
Wow.
And then I went to France the next day to Nalanda Monastery, where I took a residency.
And so even though you were running on this adrenaline, and it was surreal in that regard. Were you at all reflecting like, wow, a month ago I was living in a Manhattan apartment as a professor. Now I'm in the Himalayan mountains. I was ordained by the Dalai Lama. And moving to was it France first?
I moved to France. Yeah.
Yeah, so...
No, I didn't. New York just went... In fact, the sale of my apartment occurred without me being there.
Yeah.
I had my agent, I got a lawyer who basically sat in for me, and he basically did it, and I was only concerned that it happened, and after that, I forgot all about New York.
Wow.
In that sense, and I was just so involved with my new life, and as a monk in this monastery in France, and
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. New York, I feel like it really represents an extremely material world. So you really went on such a drastic transition. And I have a question. When you visited Nepal before the ordination,
yes,
you mentioned, and I don't want to spoil everything, but towards the end, when you were taking a taxi to go back to the United States, a crowd, and there's a whole story to this, but a crowd chased the taxi and they were shaking it up. I was wondering why. Like, so this crowd was running after you. The taxi driver panicked, and instead of speeding up, he slowed down, and they got a hold of the car and they were shaking it.
Well, because it was in the middle of a very volatile time in Nepal, because Nepal at this time is still under a monarchy, and there was a group called the Maoist rebels, and they were, for years, I think, trying to overthrow this monarchic structure, government. And, I didn't pay that much attention to it, but apparently this is really what they were. And there was some kind of demonstration going on that day, which I didn't know about, obviously. And they didn't want any cars traveling on the road. And that's why they came and chased us. And so, as I go through the book, I was just fortunate. The experience that there was someone in the car with me, a monk that befriended me the night before, who happened to be who came in the taxi with me to the airport, who was able to calm them down. But I wasn't scared. It was strange. It could have been a very dangerous situation, but somehow I was so sure that everything I was doing was right, that everything was going to work out, and that I really didn't panic, even though it was a dangerous situation.
Yeah, you had full faith in this journey to pursue the monastic life, and you felt like, I guess, something bigger than you was taking care of you.
Right, exactly.
So at this point, this is your first time living in a monastery, aside from the lead up to being ordained. So now currently you're in France.
Yes.
And this is a Tibetan Buddhist monastery.
Yes, an international Tibetan Buddhist monastery in southwest France, near Toulouse. And yes, I'd been there really for quite a number of years. And what prompted me to go there at this point was that they had just started a 5-year study program. And in this type of Tibetan Buddhism, in the Gelug tradition, which is the Dalai Lama's tradition, is a lot of emphasis on studying. It's much more, in a sense, intellectual than some of the other Tibetan, like the tradition where we are now, Woodstock. It's different. So yes, that was why I wanted to go at that particular time to begin this 5-year study program.
And so what about it didn't do it for you?
Well, after I'd been there for a couple of months, and I saw that the study program was going to be something like being in school again. I mean, there was an emphasis on exams and posting grades, and the abbot wanted to introduce the Tibetan style of debating, which is sort of an intellectual, challenging situation that you embark on with another person. And I felt there was not really any emphasis on practicing. More of a meditation, although in the Tibetan style, the meditation is not like in Zen. It's still a kind of an active recitation type of practice. But still, there is some sense of delving into the mind. And this seemed to be much more intellectually based and very abstract concepts. And I began to realize that that's not really what I wanted. And I think that experiencing it and realizing after a few months that, this is not really what I want to do. And I'm thinking I go through this 5-year study program, and then what? They're basically training monks to teach at maybe Buddhist centers. There wouldn't be monasteries. And that's the last thing I'd really want to do, is live in a Buddhist center in a city someplace. So I thought I need to find an alternative. And one of the monks there, who was a British monk, who grew up in England, he told me about there was a tradition that's not Tibetan, but the so-called Hinayana, which is really not an accurate label. It's just really the early Buddhist tradition, the earliest form of Buddhism. That there's a network of monasteries in England that I might find something more what I'm looking for, because the emphasis is only on meditation and no study at all. So it's the extreme. And not only that, these are forest monasteries, so it's a very aesthetic, challenging situation where you're living part of the time in a forest hut, and very rigorous life where you're following the monastic discipline. You don't eat after midday, and it's really very austere. But nevertheless, I thought maybe that's more what I'm looking for. Except, of course, the problem is that to leave the greater vehicle, the Mahayana, to go to what's called the lesser vehicle, the Hinayana or the Theravadan, is unheard of. No one really has ever, anyone done that. And so there's a lot of, people really were not happy that I wanted to do that. They tried to talk me out of it. But, I'm very stubborn, and I didn't listen, because I really thought that maybe I know best what I really want to do. And so I did leave, and I went to England, of course, without ever having visited these places. I had to go, because I couldn't just do a little short visit. I had to just basically do it. And so I wrote to these monasteries, and I went to England. And I know at first it was a big adjustment, because I somehow missed the color of Tibetan Buddhism. Mm-hmm. It was just so bland, in comparison. And so, not Zen-like, but still very simple. And instead of having all this incense, and there'd be one stick of incense would be lit once a week. Wow. There were no flowers. There's nothing. There was just a simple Buddha statue, and the robes even were sort of a drab, sort of golden brown color, and there was no talk of compassion and bodhicitta and enlightenment for the benefit of others. Although I think the kernel of that is in the Buddhist teachings, the early teachings, but it's not stressed. Mm. The stress is on personal liberation. And so, nevertheless, I liked England, and I was in a very, very beautiful part of South England, in this monastery, and I adjusted to it, and I was very apprehensive about my first time that I had to stay in the forest, because the monastery had a forest, 150-acre forest nearby. And normally you'd spend 6 weeks there, and then you spend 6 weeks in the main grounds. And even when you're in the forest for 6 weeks, you still come in periodically for the work period and your meal. But still, you're living there maybe 14, 16 hours of the day you're in the forest. And these huts are very, very primitive, very small, no water, no outhouse, no electricity, and it's maybe 6 by 6 feet. I mean, it's very small. Wow. And, I was a little apprehensive here in the middle of a forest, and the nearest hut is not within reach. I mean, there are the huts there, but not that near. And, you have to dig a little hole. You have to dig your own latrine. And I wasn't really so worried about animals. I was really worried, not the four-legged kind. I was really worried about the two-legged. Because thinking, maybe there are, some vagrants running around in the forest, and here I am in this little hut with this tiny little lock on the door, which was not very secure, and some of it was like all glass, and I was just very apprehensive. And but I managed, and I did stay there, and I sort of adjusted, although I never really found it conducive for my meditation. I was like nervous, especially once it got dark. I felt just so.
And you're a city person.
And I'm a city person. I really have only lived in cities, and here I am in the forest in England, and in a little hut, with like no phone or anything. I think, well, here I am, and no comforts, even just a basic, even an outhouse.
Yeah, no modern amenities.
No amenities, no electricity.
Yeah.
I had a little candle and flashlight. So I did. I remember my very first night there was really trying. It was the beginning of March, and March weather can be very volatile, and there was this intense storm, like an electrical storm, and it was sleeting and raining and sleeting and lightning and it was crashing down on this little hut. And I was just hoping they had a little gas heater, but the gas was really outside, and I was just hoping it wasn't going to run out of gas, in the middle of the night. And I remember just sitting in this little hut and thinking, I hope the roof is strong enough.
Wow.
That was my first night.
Wow.
So, but I survived it. And I stayed at this in England for, actually I ended up staying there like 2.5 years. And I gradually made the transition. I still wore my Tibetan robes at first, which I was a novelty, because the abbot wanted me to, continue being a Tibetan novice, but make the gradual transition. And so then I became a novice in the Theravada tradition eventually. And then I eventually took full ordination as a bhikkhu, as a fully ordained monk. And then I moved to their other monastery closer to London. It was not quite so austere. They actually had like a dormitory, and which I liked much better. And it was much closer to London, so there was a lot more people coming there. Thai people, Sri Lankan people bringing food, and had a very nice library. And it was a much better situation, actually. Very nice countryside. But there, of course, as you know from reading the book, the most shocking thing I did, I suppose, of all my things, was that I was beginning to feel disenchanted with this Theravada monastic tradition. I suppose, I'm always stimulated by literature, and they had a very good interfaith library at this monastery. I picked up some works by Thomas Merton, who was a very famous Christian monk who was very open to Buddhism. And so he actually became a good friend of the Dalai Lama, in fact. And I read some of his works, and it opened me up really to what I was missing in Buddhism, in this form of Buddhism, which it seemed that there was all this concern about you working out your own liberation, and I really missed some of those teachings in the Tibetan tradition of the compassion teachings, and exchanging self with other, and all these other aspects, and constantly always going over in your mind, I'm on this journey for the benefit of all sentient beings. I mean, this is like the mantra of the Tibetan Mahayana tradition. And you don't hear that at all, really, in the early tradition. I mean, there was loving kindness and this compassion that you send out, this energy, but it didn't seem to be the prime focus.
Well, so to clarify,
yes.
So there's Mahayana and there is Hinayana.
Hinayana, but Hinayana, of course, is not really an accurate label, and it's still used in the Tibetan tradition. But Hinayana really is not exactly the same as what's today's modern Theravada Buddhism. But we can basically easier say sometimes say the Southern school and the Northern school. And the Southern school is really what is the Theravadan or so-called Hinayana, meaning the smaller vehicle that focuses on the early teachings of the Buddha and personal liberation. And the Mahayana is sort of the Northern school, meaning that developed out of Sanskrit tradition, and that developed then into China and Tibet and Vietnam and Korea and Japan. That is the Mahayana, the great vehicle. And there, the whole emphasis is on achieving liberation or enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, that you're going to bring them all with you somehow. So this is the difference. And I suppose I was beginning to miss that. And I even have mentioned in the book that I had some making my own judgment of some of the monks who have been monks for a long time. And they're, of course, in England, they were all Westerners, mostly, European and English, and normally very, very few Americans. And I didn't sense a great compassionate impulse. And so I started reading some of his works by Thomas Merton, this Christian monk, and I somehow picked up the Benedictine rule, which was the very first Christian monastic rule from the 6th century. And the prologue of it was really very beautiful and very inspiring. And some of Thomas Merton's works on monasticism, he was a very good writer, very lyrical. And he was celebrating Christian monastic life. And that just somehow just stimulated something from like 20 years ago. I always in my mind imagined monastic life in a Christian sense. And so all this stuff started happening. And at the same time, talking about causes and conditions, Ajahn Sumedho, who was the one who founded all these monasteries in England, he's actually an American, but very, very respected. And he's quite elderly, actually. He wasn't that old at that time, he was in his 70s. And it was going to be his last year before he retired, and he was doing all these teachings on the sound of silence. And I think of the Simon Garfunkel song, but it was not really quite like that. Meaning if you very quiet your mind, there's this cosmic hum that's always with us. And he focused on that as a meditation, which is not a typical Buddhist thing to do. And he also talked often about the ultimate sense of reality, which he called the unconditioned, which very much sounds like God, even though he didn't use the word God. So all this, I started listening for the sound of silence. And I would take these walks, because I every afternoon I always take walks in the countryside. That's something I have always done while living in the countryside, even in the cities. And so the English countryside is really very beautiful. And I would take these walks and then stop and stand still and just listen to the sound of silence. And in my mind, I had this verse from the Psalms, which is interesting because I really didn't remember any of the Old Testament Psalms. But one of them had come up in one of the books I'd read from Psalm 46, I believe, in the Jewish notation, which is, "Be still and know I'm God." And I started reciting that in my mind as I was listening to the sound of silence in the English countryside. All this together, and I somehow just began to sense something was churning. And I was making a connection which what I thought was some kind of experience of a cosmic force that I was thinking maybe is God. So here I am, a Buddhist monk, and in the English countryside, and I'm beginning to think this. And I'm reading the Benedictine rule, Thomas Merton, and all this very, this sense of monastic life is living at one with God. That's really what Christian monastic life is supposed to be, a brotherhood of men or women living together to live in God's presence. And all the different prayers you go through during the day, in the liturgy, that's what it's all about. So this was all very inviting to me. And so I, being a former medievalist, I started visiting their medieval churches all over England, not surprising. And I went into this one church, and it was a 12th century church right near the monastery. And there was like just a simple crucifix. No, it was a cross. It wasn't a crucifix. Jesus was not on it. So that's the difference between a crucifix and a cross. It was just a cross. And I went into this church and this cross, and I just stood in front of this cross. And I just stood there very silently, all alone in this medieval church. And all of a sudden there was this powerful force coming from this cross. It was just like an ecstatic force that was just like rushing at me. And it nearly knocked me over. It was just so intense. And I didn't know what to make of it, but I had the sense I was experiencing something that was not on this realm. I didn't know what it was. And here I am in the church, obviously, and it's a cross. So I put all this together, and I had been reading also some of the Gospels of Jesus, which I had read in graduate school, actually. But, I read it without just as literature. I didn't really pay that much attention to it. And now I was, realizing, wow, the teachings of Jesus are really quite amazing. The Sermon on the Mount, it actually is very Jewish at the same time as well. But little bit I knew of Judaism, I said no one would say that this is not really Jewish. I mean, but the teachings that Jesus was giving were really quite beautiful and would be nothing really against Judaism either. So I was seeing all these things. And somehow I thought, I have to find a way to bring in this aspect to my monastic life. And so I thought, maybe this is why I'm here. I'm going to make a bridge with Christianity and Buddhist monasticism. And here I am in England, which of course is a Christian country. And so that's really what I thought I would do. But then the more I read about Christian monasticism, I realized, well, I think maybe that's what I'm looking for. Because it's a monastic brotherhood, all in my ideal sense, all living together, living in a sense, trying to commune with God.
Yeah, so we're about to jump into the Christian chapter.
Yes, we are.
And before we take that detour, I want to ask you a question about, still with the Mahayana and Hinayana.
Yes.
One thing I've learned about my time here, mostly in conversation, is a big concept of Buddhism is interconnectedness.
Mm-hmm.
And the emphasis on meditation, at least with Mahayana, is that when you're taking back, like when you're controlling your mind and bringing yourself to that state,
mm-hmm.
you're benefiting other people as well because we're all interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So do you believe that it's fair to discount the Hinayana, sector with when they're meditating, even if it's not for that same purpose? Do you think?
Well, I think with the Mahayana, it's not necessarily while you're meditating you're making that connection. You're taking it as a motivation before you even begin. That you're doing this solely for the purpose of all sentient beings, because what you're hoping to get, you're hoping to reach the state where you can actually develop the ability to help everyone reach that same state along with you, which is not in the Hinayana. But the actual meditation itself, I think, is really quite similar to what you're doing. In fact, a lot of what we call the shamatha and vipassana are pure Hinayana practices. They're not Mahayana practices. They're just different ways, perhaps, of doing it and different motivations, but the practice themselves are pretty much the same. So I think the meditation level is just really, it's the aspiration, the motivation. That's the difference. And why you're doing it. Because in the Hinayana, I've been using this label, which, the Theravadins really don't like using that label, but just to make it easier, there is the idea of dependent origination, which is very much in Mahayana as well, but we tend to think of it as more interconnectedness. While in the Theravada tradition, it's more that one thing is connected. There is nothing that exists completely by itself. Everything is a combination of factors. There's always a cause and effect. And so there's a whole chain of that in the very schematically presented in both the Hinayana and the Mahayana, except in the Mahayana tradition, it's basically more a sense of we are so interconnected that therefore when we do the meditation, such as exchanging oneself with others, which is a Mahayana practice, we realize that we really are equal, we are really the same. There is no real distinction, because by breaking down the ego, which is also Hinayana, we do break down the ego. Here, we're breaking down the ego so that we can actually realize that we are not different from anyone else. And so we are not really separate. And this is really more emphasized in the Mahayana tradition. And of course, in your meditations, you can basically sense this all-inclusivity. And that so any action I do is going to have an effect on someone else. So if it's a good thing, it's going to have a positive effect. And but really, in some sense, we are still trying to work on ourselves, because the only way we're really going to really help anyone is if we can get through our own obstructions and through our own, habits and all habitual way of delusional thinking, is to do that. And so the idea, what I found did not work so well, but I thought in the Tibetan monastic tradition, I saw it in Ananda, was that people were not spending enough time going into themselves. And so therefore, they weren't really going to be able to help anyone, because they still had their own hang-ups, they had their own stuff, their own sort of self-centeredness, but it was disguised in the sense that I'm really, really working for the benefit of all sentient beings. But unless you work on yourself, you're not really going to help anyone. Mm-hmm. And so that is some of the weakness in the Christian philanthropy, or like the Catholic Church. They have lots of charities, but the people are not learning necessarily how to work on themselves so that they are really going to help people, not just on a material level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. And so you were missing the compassionate
compassion aspect of it, yes.
And now you're on your way to loving thy neighbor.
Love thy neighbor as thyself.
Transition.
Yes, exactly.
So,
which was, of course, I can say not going to be well received, because I had just taken my full ordination as a bhikkhu. And just a couple of months later, I started researching, because now we're in the internet age. And so I started writing to monasteries in America, Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries, because, I wanted to make some contact and of course I presented myself as I was a really strange case for them. I'm not even Christian, and I have a Jewish background as a Buddhist monk, and I was, so you can imagine, And then, of course, on the Buddhist side, the abbot who took over from this Ajahn Sumedho, who ordained, who retired, I was assigned as his attendant, and here he is, I'm telling him now, now I want to go and visit these Christian monasteries, he was horrified, because, the British, and especially British Buddhists, can be really very anti-Christian.
Wow.
Because they all had Christian upbringings, and they basically thought, well, it's silly stuff.
Uh-huh.
That was his attitude. He was he had, sort of like a upper middle class background, and he was very, who can take that seriously? Mm. Even though he had obviously Christian background. So he was not supporting it at all. And so there I was in a position, I had to visit these Christian monasteries. I'd never been to one. But I didn't really want to officially leave the monastery in England yet, because, most of it didn't work out. But, he was not giving his permission. So he said, I can't stop you from going, but, you can't really come back if you leave, because I was going to leave during a retreat period. But I figured, well, I'm going to leave my stuff here anyway. I can come back, and if I really realize I made a mistake, I'm sure I can beg forgiveness and they would let me stay. And that's what I was thinking. So I went off, and I went to, I took a trip to America, and of course, I realized I couldn't go to these monasteries dressed as a monk. I mean, I was so strange anyway. So as soon as I got to Heathrow, to the airport, I went to the bathroom and I took off my robes. And I just kept like a little tunic jacket on, just something to have. But I had clothes which I had secretly bought when I was on one of my trips to America, because I didn't have any clothing. I didn't have anything to wear. And so I went to these monasteries actually dressing in regular clothing to visit. I visited 2 monasteries in America. And then I went back to England. Neither of the monasteries met my romantic expectations. In fact, I went to the one that Thomas Merton had lived in, and it was a very famous monastery in Kentucky. And that was disappointing. But then I went to one in Oregon, and I liked the community more so, because there was a larger community, and they had a seminary there. And I realized why they were so interested in me. They had a college division within the seminary, and they thought I could teach some of the literature courses because they had a professor coming in from outside to teach them. So I think that was part of the attraction. I would teach them for free. And I thought, okay, I thought I liked the idea of teaching actually, again, and living in a monastery. I thought that somehow would bring my two worlds together. But then unfortunately, I went back to England then to get the rest of my things and to say goodbye and take official leave of the abbot and the community there. And by the time I came back to America, the community in this monastery in Oregon that I was going to go to, I even bought my ticket to go there. They had a meeting, and there were some very conservative elements in that community who said that, no, we can't. He's not even a Christian. How can we take him into the monastery? And he's old. We're not going to get that much mileage out of him. How long is he going to teach? Why go through all this trouble? And so they rescinded their invitation. And there I was back in New York. I had left the monastery in England, and I had no place to go.
And now how old were you at this point?
I was like, this was 2011, so I was 57. I was 57.
Wow. And you were trying to get baptized, right?
Yes, well, because then I thought, okay, they said, if you get baptized, you would have a better chance, but maybe you can find a place, but maybe still not go back there. So I thought, okay, well, what am I going to do? I have to find it's going to take time because the Catholics have this process you have to go through. It's like a training course that takes like months, like 6 months. And then you have to, be part of a parish church for like a year or two and before you can join a monastery. So this is going to take a couple of years. So I need to find a place to live and, where I can teach English again at the university for a couple of years. And so I decided to go south because, I didn't need a place where it would be affordable to live.
Back to the south.
Back to the south, and I went to Georgia. Because, I figured, well, where can I go? I didn't want to go to Florida where my brother was, because I really didn't like Florida. So I went to Athens, Georgia. The University of Georgia was there, which is a big university. So I feel like maybe I can get an adjunct teaching position there. It'd probably be very inexpensive to live. And so, I did go to Florida to my brother's because I had nothing. I needed to get a car and a computer and a phone. And, I had nothing. I had nothing really left. And so my brother helped me get all those things. And then I moved to Athens, Georgia. And almost immediately I contacted I thought about it and I realized, I don't think I can really last a couple of years doing this. So a friend said, why don't you try the Episcopal Church? They're much more open than the Catholics, and they also have a couple of monasteries around. So I found out that there was one in Michigan, a Benedictine Episcopal Church, but affiliated really with the Church of England, more Anglican, but it's in Michigan. And so I thought, well, let me see if I can get maybe baptized a little bit faster. So I made an appointment with a priest in the Episcopal Church in Athens, Georgia. I gave my whole little story, and he was a little bit startled by my whole story, he used to say. And so I met with him, and I said, well, I'd like to get baptized, and in a fairly reasonable amount of time. The Catholic Church drags everything else along. I said, I've read a lot. I understand, the basics. I've read the scriptures. I'm prepared. And he said, so I said, so when would you like to, do this baptism? He said, well, how about tomorrow? I said, no, that's the time frame I'm looking at. so I got baptized the next day in a private ceremony.
How was that?
That was actually a really lovely ceremony. Even though it's the Episcopal Church, they followed the same procedure as, I think, the Catholic. And while they don't actually douse you into the water like the Orthodox Church does, he said he was a former Catholic Franciscan, and he left. He didn't tell me why he left, but he left now. He's the Episcopal Church. And he said, let's put a towel around you. I said, why? Is there going to be a lot of water? I said, well, he said, I like to do it fairly thoroughly. And so he doused me with water. I mean, like a huge bucket of water over me. And he did the very traditional, in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, which is a very traditional way of doing a baptism. And it was really quite beautiful. There's a whole little ritual, and he asks all these questions, and it's really very much like the Catholic ritual. And I really felt something happened. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but something happened. It was a very beautiful church, I must say. Really, it was a 19th century church in Athens. And I went out immediately. I mean, I sat in the church for a while by myself and just meditated in the church. And then I went to a shop. There was like a religious shop, and I bought myself a little crucifix. And I was really excited. I went to Michigan, and I took part. They had like an orientation program for like a month just to try it out. And I saw it's not a perfect place, but I thought, it's better than teaching English in Athens, Georgia for 3 years at like a quarter of what I was earning in New York. And I thought, I just can't do this. And grading all those papers and reading all those horrible essays again, I said, I just can't do it. And so I thought, it was a nice little monastery. I must say it was a small community, very nice library. And the rooms were nice. They had a private bath in the rooms. I said, I think I can manage it. And they followed the very traditional hours of the prayers throughout the day. I thought it was really kind of conservative in that sense. I was really impressed, even though I wasn't Catholic. And so I said, I think it'll work. Michigan was nice. It was countryside, a rural community in southwest Michigan. So I thought, okay. And they said, you're not the perfect candidate. You're a little bit old, and you've only been baptized very recently, but they couldn't be that fussy. They only had 6 monks there. So they said, you're welcome to come. And so I did. And I stayed there for a year. I became a novice, Benedictine novice. And then, but then I began to realize that, it's not quite ascetic enough. I mean, the Benedictines are a little bit worldly, and, they had a lovely reading room just for the monks with like magazine subscriptions, so like 50 different magazines from Sports Illustrated to People magazine to to Newsweek, and it was like they had a television, and so I thought, the conversations was very worldly, and I thought maybe this is not exactly. Then again, I happened upon a book, and this book was about the Jesus Prayer and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which I knew nothing about. I mean, of course, in New York, I knew that there were Greek Orthodox people and Russian Orthodox. I can tell from their black veils and their beards, and you'd see them sometimes in New York. And I thought, what interesting tradition, but it's only for Greeks or Russians. I didn't think it was for Western, other people. But then I realized, I did some research, and I realized, wow, this is a really very mystical form of Christianity. And these are really, they had this mantra, this Jesus prayer that they do like thousands and thousands of times throughout the day. It's sort of like a meditation mantra. And they live a very austere life, and they're in prayer all the time. And I thought, I wonder if there are any in America. And I turned out that there were a few of these Orthodox monasteries in America. And the wheels started turning. And I thought, let me just think about this for a while. I didn't jump into anything.
Which was the first time, right?
It was the first time. So we're not making any sudden moves. We're going to just really gradually. And so what I started doing, I started incorporating the Jesus prayer, which is basically this recitation, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. And you say it internally, like over and over again, thousands of times. And so I started doing this Jesus prayer, like in the church, in the Benedictine monastery, after our early morning service, like at 5 a.m, I would just sit in the church and do this prayer for like an hour by myself. And just began to get the feel of it and just seeing if this is, a direction that really called to me. And so after several months, I thought, okay, let me write to couple of these monasteries and see if they're open to me and my background. And I try to not give all the details. It's a little overwhelming. But a place in Ohio was open for me coming there to visit. It's a small monastery in Ohio, Greek Orthodox, but they were all Americans at this place, except for one Greek there. And so I had to make a decision to go there without actually having been there, because I didn't want to use my present monastery like as a hotel just to come and go.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to decide, okay, am I going to leave and then hope that it's going to work out? And I had to do that, and I did, and they were very gracious about it. They were nice about it, and when I explained. And so I went to this Greek Orthodox monastery, and I said, wow, this is really very different. Extremely, I'd never been in a church like this. It's not at all like a Catholic church or an Episcopal church. It's a very different. And so, I stayed there for 10 days, and I interacted with the community of 7 monks. And I said, wow, this is really a brotherhood, and they're all kind of quirky, as you would expect. But they were very warm and welcoming. And so I got the green light, but I couldn't come right away because there was some complications. So I had 4 or 5 weeks. So I went to visit my parents who were living in Florida at this point. And they were, now in their 80s. And, they expressed they were shocked at first. When I first told them I was leaving Buddhism for Christianity, they was like, what? But when I said I was going to come back to America, they liked that part of it. Mm-hmm. And so whatever they felt about me becoming a Christian monk, they didn't express. They were focusing on the fact that I was coming back to America. And so what I decided to do, because I had all these weeks and I didn't really know, didn't want to stay in New York that long or in Florida. So I went to Israel, to Jerusalem. I made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for 2 weeks. But it was really a Christian pilgrimage, even though I was going to Jerusalem as a Jew. And it's interesting while I was there, and I do write about this in the book, I just spontaneously, I was walking in, I stayed in the old city of Jerusalem at a Catholic guest house, which was located at a beautiful location right in the old city. They had this patio, a rooftop patio, that had this amazing view of the old city. And I would go up there at sunrise every day and just watch the sun rise over the old city. And it was just so amazing being in Jerusalem. Just the color, the light, the gold of the buildings. It was just, the dome, of course. And so one day I was walking through the old city, and I decided I wanted to go to Sinai, because I wanted to climb Mount Sinai, even though I know in Jewish tradition it's not known really where Moses received the commandments, but in the Christian tradition they have basically focused on this particular mountain, which could be very much near that's really the route where Moses and they all left was in this Sinai Peninsula. So it's very possible it was, if not that mountain, it might have been a mountain nearby, where it happened. So I wanted to go there, and of course it was very risky because there was apparently some terrorist attack somewhere in the Sinai, and the State Department advised Americans not to go to Sinai. Mm. So I went to a little travel agent in Old City, and I said, is this true? Is it really dangerous to go to this particular place I wanted to go to, which was St. Catherine's Monastery, which is built on the very base of Mount Sinai? And she said, well, there have been no troubles in that area of Sinai, and, people have been going there.
Which is, the Israelis always respond with, no, it's fine.
Exactly.
They would say that.
They would say that, so I believed her. I said, okay, take a chance. So I booked a little, but I said, are there any groups going there? She said, well, unfortunately, recently no one's really been going there. But, you might find an individual to share the cost, but I couldn't find anyone. So I said, I have to go myself. So I had my own little private, person I was going to meet at the border, who was going to drive me hours long, because the Sinai is very long. It's a very big peninsula. And so I got this little package deal just for me. And I had to go to Eilat, which is you probably know. Yeah. The extreme southern part of Israel. And it was quite an adventure. I had to take a bus, a 4-hour bus ride, to go down to Eilat, which is in the southern point of Israel in the desert. And from there, you then cross over into Taba, which is the border crossing into Egypt, which is the Sinai. And so this little thing that I booked was going to include this staying overnight in Eilat, and then crossing the border, and then an Egyptian vehicle was going to pick me up there and then drive me to Sinai. I mean, this is really quite exciting because I'm doing this all alone, of course. And I walked into Egypt, and it was like day and night. In Israel, the border crossing, like it was almost like East Germany. There were like lights and mirrors and like petitions and all these cameras everywhere. And then I go through all this bureaucracy to leave Israel, and I walk into Egypt. Like there's like nobody there. I find myself like I see like a little booth, and there's like a man sitting like in a little like a folding chair, and he's like sitting. I was wondering, am I supposed to go to him? Like, is this the border crossing? And he like looks at me and says, "Welcome to Egypt." So I said, "Are you the person I have to show my passport?" He said, "I can look at it."
Yeah, if you want.
If you want. Here it is. Oh, okay.
Wow, drastic difference.
And I said, I'm hoping there's going to be a car here because there was like nobody there. It was like in the middle of nowhere. Now I'm looking. I said, is there? Where's the car? Which would pick me up? And then suddenly I see an Egyptian walking towards me, and he had my name. He addressed me. I said, are you my driver? He said, well, I'm the driver, but we're going to pick up your tour guide someplace else. I said, okay. So we go in this car, and like there's like a van, and just me and the driver. And we're driving, and then we pick up my tour guide, and then we drive through this, the Sinai desert. It was really quite incredible. And there were like still some nomad Bedouins there, and it's so desolate. I mean, it's extremely desolate. And we get there, and then we get to St. Catherine's Monastery, and it was a wonderful experience. To climb the mountain, you had to get a Bedouin, one of these nomad guides, because you're not allowed to climb it yourself. And of course, there were a couple of groups of people, but I was by myself, so I had my own guide just for me. And you leave like at 1 a.m. to climb up the mountain, and the climb really was not that bad. And it was just so amazing because it was a full moon, and it was like being on the moon. It was so desolate, and you had the moon shining on this landscape that was just incredibly desolate. And we're like following the camel path, and very gradual. And then we go, and my guide takes me up the mountain, and I get to the very summit, and it's still dark, and he leaves me up there, and he wants to hang out with his friends in one of these little tents.
Yeah, just to let people know, this was at night for
this
the
is at
sunrise.
Night. Yes, exactly, because the whole idea is to go up there for sunrise. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people do climb Mount Sinai for the sunrise, because it's an amazing place to be at sunrise, and not necessarily for any religious reason. But of course, I was going there for a religious, point, and also for the sunrise. And so, I'm there, and it was very chilly and windy up there because we were really high up, and it's in a really desolate place. I was all alone because there was no one else where I was, and I'm in a little crook of a rock, and I'm there with my prayer beads, my little beads, and counting my Jesus prayers. And I'm there and waiting, and an hour goes by. I said, I think the sun should have risen by now. And I'm looking, it looks it's like getting light, but there's no sun. And then I realized that, oh my God, the sun is up, but I'm facing west. I didn't see the sun.
And you were meditating.
I was meditating the whole time. And so anyway, it was a wonderful experience. And in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, maybe Moses really was here. Maybe he did receive the Ten Commandments. And even so, there have been, hundreds and thousands of pilgrims have come up this way thinking that he did. Mm-hmm. And that gives it a lot of power right in that.
Yeah, definitely.
And it really was a very, very special experience. And so I had a really nice experience. I stayed in Jerusalem almost the whole time except for going to Mount Sinai. And going into the Judean desert, I went to probably one of the oldest Christian monasteries that exist in the Judean desert, near the Dead Sea. And I ended up spontaneously being invited to spend the night there, which was a wonderful experience. And I got to do that. And I ended up eventually getting my saint's name was the person who founded that monastery, which is an interesting coincidence.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, we're skimming through a lot, but
we're skimming through a lot. Yes,
there's so much
I know.
And,
yes.
Upcoming is about 8 years in a monastery in an Eastern Orthodox.
Yes.
So, inevitably have to skim through some of
Yes,
that.
of course.
But it is a very interesting chapter. I definitely recommend people read about this because there's so many details in between all the stories and getting into the mind and just everything that's happening. So in the monastery, when you come back from Israel, you
Yes.
went to which monastery?
The Greek, St. Gregory Palamas Greek Orthodox Monastery.
The one
in Ohio.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you were there 8 years.
8 years. Mm-hmm.
So one thing I was curious about, and spoiler alert, you're eventually also going to go into Judaism for
Yes.
a brief period. You were wearing, you bought a Shema necklace or a Star of David necklace?
Yes, when I bought it, yes, when I was going to, that's right, I somehow got sidetracked. While I was in Jerusalem, and I was preparing to go to Mount Sinai, I had bought one of those hiking poles. I'm walking through the old city with my hiking pole, and this man outside a shop, there were a lot of Jewish religious shops. He said, "What are you going to do with that pole?" I said, "Well, I'm going to Mount Sinai." I said, "Oh, really? I know friends who've been there. Hey, come in and have a coffee with me." So I went to this shop, and there's all these beautiful religious Jewish items. I assumed he was Jewish. This guy, he was kind of like Semitic looking. The more I'm talking to him, I realize he's Palestinian, actually. But he's selling all this Jewish stuff. And he wasn't really trying to get me to buy anything. We just had a coffee and conversation. He showed me photographs of people who had climbed Mount Sinai. And then as I'm leaving, I saw they had these Star of Davids. And what was so interesting about the Star of David had the Shema engraved on it. Mm. And he said, I designed it. He designed it, this young man.
And the Shema is a fundamental Jewish prayer.
Yes. And it is really the only Jewish prayer that I still remember.
Mm-hmm. Which it tends to be the case for a lot of Jews who are not religious.
Yeah.
Even in Germany, they teach that a lot of people who were Jewish during the Holocaust mm-hmm. and did not associate with their Judaism before their death would recite the Shema.
At least the opening line. I mean, I didn't know all the stanzas, but the opening line, because that's how all the services start, right, mm-hmm. with the Shema. And I knew it, of course. I still remembered it. And there it was engraved. And I said, wow, this is so nice. I think I want to get this. It was silver. It was very expensive. I mean, I normally never buy jewelry. And so, of course, they had to bargain it. It was still, expensive. But I thought, I really wanted to have it. And so I started wearing it along with the crucifix together. I wore them together around me.
And did you wear that the whole 8 years?
Well, this is really very interesting.
Yeah, yes, I was curious about this. Like you had both at the same time.
Them both.
Which also you were saying when you were learning about Jesus, you didn't take it as, like you were saying before, it wasn't a contradiction to Judaism.
No.
So you had, and I mean, I'm planning this podcast is going to be called The Gray Area. But I think it's fascinating that people don't look at the possibility of Judaism and Christianity not needing to be two totally different things, and that Christianity, was Jesus' intention to start another religion, or was it just to, I guess, add to current teachings? But the two religions over time became distinct. And it is fascinating, and then I'm thinking about you wearing the two religions on your neck.
I did, and I did wear it. In fact, I eventually got a different crucifix when I went to Mount Athos. I got a wooden carved one, but I wore them together all the time I was there. And then they started getting tangled up. The chain, so I started wearing one under my t-shirt and the other one
symbolic.
Yeah, exactly. They're all tangled up. And so I started wearing, and I wore it all the time. I think I'm not sure if I slept with them. But anyway, what was interesting, I didn't think anybody knew because I always wore it underneath my t-shirt. And years later, near the end already, when I was preparing to take my life vows at the Greek Orthodox Monastery in the 8th year. There I had a meeting with the abbot and just a pre-talk, and he said, when you go through the ceremony of the taking the life vows, don't wear the Star of David. I figured, how did he know I was wearing the Star of David? Because I never showed it.
And he never mentioned it. Up to that
No,
point.
but apparently, sometimes in the hot weather, it must have fallen out of my T-shirt and it must have been visible. And he normally was not a very observant person, but he obviously observed it. I was so shocked when he said that I really wanted to wear it though, but I can't because I'm going to have to take off my stuff and put on these other robes so he could see if I'm wearing it. So I had to obey him. But as soon as the ceremony was over, I put it back on. Because he didn't say never to wear it again. At least I'm not disobeying him. So just not for that very holy rite. It was a very powerful ceremony when I took the life vows, as you can imagine. But it's interesting, as I write in the book, I go through, trying to reflect on what my relationship to Jesus, and I still don't know exactly, but one thing I am quite sure is that I never really related to Jesus as a Christian. Mm-hmm. And I never thought of myself as a Christian. Because one thing, I definitely had some type of distrust and discomfort with the church, the institution of the church. That was for sure right from the beginning. And so even we would have events when the bishop came, and I showed that photograph, I never really felt comfortable with the idea of the bishop and all this sort of this ecclesiastical world, because to me, I had a relationship with Jesus as some sort of conduit to the ultimate reality, through an accessible way for me to relate to what was, as Sumedho called, the unconditioned.
Yeah, like a physical world manifestation where you actually have a human being.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's how I related to Jesus. I really had to relate. I definitely had a connection to him, but the problem came is I could not really connect to the Virgin Mary. Mm-hmm. And in the Orthodox monastic tradition, she is very up there, right below Jesus. I mean, she is very venerated. And there are feasts just dedicated to her. And, we have the veneration of the icons, where you kiss the icons, which took me a long time to be able to do that. But I tried as much as I could. It was hard for me to feel a warmth and closeness that I knew that all my monastic brothers had to the Virgin Mary. So that was one thing that I never was able to do. Jesus, I think I developed my relationship with him. It's probably different than theirs, but we never spoke about it because they were all cradle Christians. So I'm sure they always had a relationship that I related to Jesus, and I somehow thought, well, maybe in some way he is a manifestation of God, at least some way that God is living through him that I could relate to. That's how I was relating to Jesus. So I think some of my Jewish family and friends thought I never did, but it's true. I did relate to Jesus, but not really as a Christian. And I didn't really see him as a Jew, but I figured, well, he was a Jew, actually. Mm-hmm. He didn't start a Christian religion. I mean, Paul did more of that than Jesus. Paul really is one who somehow came up with the fact of Jesus being God. Jesus himself never said that.
So I'm curious, and admittedly, I'm intrigued by it because I too am Jewish.
Right.
But how come you really wanted to wear the Star of David throughout that whole time? Was it a subconscious thing? Or?
I think it was going to Jerusalem. And even though I didn't really go to any of the Jewish sites, but being there, and I did go to the Wailing Wall. I was there on Sabbath, and I was impressed by the ultra-Orthodox davening at the wall. And as I do mention, I sort of stood back, even though they weren't going to take me, but some of not the Hasidim, but some of the others might have wanted me to join their minyan. And I didn't feel comfortable doing that, but I was impressed watching the Hasidim pray at the wall. Mm-hmm. The way, they were just so in their prayer. And something I realized that even though I did not have this background, but somehow I thought of my family. And I think that was the Jewishness. And that's, I think, why I was wearing the Star of David was for the family.
Was it at all discomfort? Like, wow, I've strayed the complete opposite of my family. Not that it is the complete opposite, but a lot of American Jews feel like, and like you said, your parents too,
right.
Christianity is if you become Christian, that's like, you're totally leaving Judaism. So was it maybe a feeling of okay, but I'm holding on to it a little bit, or
Well, at the time, I don't think I looked at it that way. I didn't look that what I was doing would be so shocking.
Mhm.
Because, again, I was doing it as a spiritual quest.
yeah,
And my parents didn't really express what they were thinking about it. And I didn't really think that I was making a big move against Judaism by becoming Christian. I really didn't think of it that way at all. But by wearing the Star of David, I thought, I was brought up in a very warm, culturally Jewish family. And I somehow wanted that to be with me as I was continuing on this journey. And I never really felt that I was going to become a Christian, but what I was going to continue my spiritual journey in a Christian direction without becoming a Christian. And that, of course, was something that inevitably eventually was not going to work. And that's why I eventually leave. But I gave it a good run for it. I did my best because I somehow was benefiting. By opening up to the devotion to somehow a God presence was something that I needed because the Theravadan tradition was so, I felt a little bit cold compared to the Tibetan, which of course had all these deities to have devotion to, and you have devotion to the guru, and devotion was so much a part of the path. And I realized that that was something I maybe needed. And here the Christian was fulfilling that. And so it was really a devotional path to reach some type of lived relationship with the divine. That's really what I was looking for. And Jesus filled that. But there are parts of the church I just didn't pay attention to. And some of the holidays I didn't really like. And then, of course, I became there were moments when I was very much aware of an anti-Semitic element in the Orthodox Church, which the Catholic churches, to their benefit, have done, have really worked at trying to eliminate from the liturgy. The Orthodox doesn't like to change anything, and especially Easter time, Holy Week. I was a principal reader in the church because I couldn't really do the very complicated Byzantine chanting. And I was a good reader, so I was reading. And a lot of it was mostly the Old Testament Psalms I did. But then there were sometimes we read works from the New Testament. Not Gospels, but just other works later on. And there was some, especially during Holy Week, very strongly anti-Jewish rhetoric. And I remember getting to those parts and I really just choked over reading these words. And I would mumble them. I could not read them. And I really was feeling a conflict that this should not still be read because it's very, it could prompt hate and misunderstanding, even though obviously it wasn't blatant in the church. But I was feeling discomfort with that. And this was, later on in my time there. And so, yes, I think I became gradually, and I guess I'm jumping ahead before you ask the questions, but I just started opening up my Jewish roots.
Yeah. I wanted to go a little further, though, into that physical manifestation. Is that still, because you mentioned in the book that each phase served its purpose
Yes.
for the time and that it was worthwhile. And so Jesus was a part of opening you up to the devotion aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like still to today you need some sort of physical manifestation because the concept of God or the divine or some sort of higher power, and it's just so abstract that having a somewhat of a clear version of it, whether it be with deities or something that seems tangible?
I think in a way, yes. However, what I realize now that I'm back in Tibetan Buddhism is the mistake I made the first time around is trying to make it too solidifying. Because the idea now, which has dawned on me, that in these deity practices in Tibetan Buddhism and the relationship with one's guru, it's really manifestations of yourself. Mm-hmm. You are bringing this out in your mind because everything is really imagining. And so it's not physical. but it is a form that you can visualize. And the idea I think was helpful those years in Christianity, the idea of surrendering yourself to something else was helpful. And I began to do that. I was able to do that to some extent with Jesus during those years I was there. And in that, I think, has helped me now realize that you can't just surrender that ego self, but the only way you're really going to connect with ultimate reality is that self has to really just be dissolved. And I didn't quite get that during my Christian years. It was blocking it. I still had that sense of self. Me here, Jesus there, me here, God there. And it's never going to work that way as long as I'm still here.
Yeah, you were missing that non-dualist.
Yes, exactly. Which is, I think, you have to bridge that in mystical Judaism, from my that I explored, and in mystical Christianity. You have to get beyond that dualistic frame of mind. And that's where I think there's a lot of commonality in the different religions and the spiritual aspects.
Yeah, I mean, from the very little I've been exposed to, I've also learned about that as well. It's interesting because for me, my spiritual journey is, so I'm 24. I barely had much. You know, I've conceptualized and I've pondered over things, but I feel the spirit, but I barely have ritual. And I think, you know, I have my personal things. I speak from the heart to what I believe is God, but it's my own conception of it, which is really the conception that I can't understand it. It's beyond me. It's beyond my abilities to comprehend. And that's just the way I see it right now. I don't think that's forever necessarily. But the devotion aspect is something I've missed because of that, because God is so abstract to me, and that there's not like an exact way. So I guess my practice has been gratitude, and I feel a spiritual connection in my gratitude. Like before I eat meals, I think about every ingredient that I'm going to have. And, you know, I have some of my own practice, but I could see how that devotional aspect. Here at the monastery, I never took refuge, and when I see people prostrate themselves to the Buddha, I can't see myself doing it because I do believe it has power to it, and I don't feel connected and ready for that, at least at this time. And I very much respect it, and I admire that people have a physical way of devotion and worship. So I definitely see the appeal, and I could see with Christianity, Jesus as a human. You know, this as the Messiah, as this person that is transcended and divine in this physical world. Like, I think that's comforting to us if we could have something so clear like that. But so that a little spiel by me, but we are, you know, there's so much that happened at the monastery, and it's 8 years, but we'll go towards the end now. I mean, you were learning Hebrew.
Yes.
You were
I began learning Hebrew because, well, several things had happened. You know, I always get into these research projects, and I luckily was still able to keep my laptop in my room, although I didn't have internet access except on Sunday afternoons on the shared computer. But I would download lots and lots of things. And I started exploring, besides I went through a period of exploring medieval Christian mysticism, but then somehow I got into the topic of the Jewish roots of Christianity. And I became very, very interested. I read a lot about the Judaism during the time of Christ, right before and right after, and some of the mystical tradition, that very early mystical tradition. And at the same time also, since I've been reading in the church, the Orthodox church services are very, very long. And we go through actually the entire book of Psalms every week, and at least maybe 30 Psalms maybe every day, the same ones. And then all 150 every week. And I was a principal reader. I was reading probably about 3/4 of the Psalms every week. And I'm reading, of course, an English translation. And then somehow I just got in the idea that, well, I really wonder what it's like to read them in Hebrew. And so I then started, I found a book, a course book, which I downloaded. And I spent a year actually studying Hebrew in my room every night. Because, it's a very arduous work schedule. I had very little time because I worked 6 or 7 hours a day in the candle shop making candles. Then there was to clean up after meals and all kinds of other, and not to mention 5 hours a day in the church with services. So I had just not very much time. So in the evenings, I started studying Hebrew and basically the grammar, because that's how I always learn a language, through the grammar. And then I got this wonderful, wonderful book. I got it for I think it was my 65th birthday present to myself. It is the Old Testament, but it's in Hebrew, but it's for someone to learn to read. So it has every single word is annotated grammatically. And so this way you can really see exactly, the grammar of that word and the translation. And so I started, some of the Psalms I really liked. I started reading them in Hebrew and knowing exactly what I was reading because I was able to see word for word what I was reading. And then that led also to, I just felt I wanted to write out the Shema, all 3 passages of it in Hebrew calligraphy. And oddly enough, I did that during Lent. I mean, really.
Wow.
So that was, I hope I'm not going to tell anybody I'm doing this. Because I wrote out all, the 3 passages in Hebrew letters, and I translated them word for word, literal translation of it. And I started putting together a little prayer book. And this is all just gradually unfolding. And at the same time, I started reading on Jewish mysticism and the Hasidim. I started reading some of the Hasidic people and the Baal Shem and some of the other from the 18th century, some of the really great Hasidic mystics. And also about some of the earlier medieval mystics. And I was fascinated by the whole idea of Jewish mysticism, which I knew nothing about. So all these things started happening together. And I realized that, well, I've got to somehow bring it all together. I am somehow going to be an Orthodox monk and still being a Jew at the same time. And I then started exploring writings by what were called Messianic Jews. Some of them were Messianic Jews, but some of them also were Jewish Christians. There actually were priests who were born Jewish, who became Catholic, but maintained their Jewish identity. And they were theologians. So I started reading these works by these people. I said, wow, I understand what they're trying to do. And maybe I can do it, but I need to find monastics. These were not monastics, they were priests. And so I tried to see if there were any monks out there doing what I'm doing. And I got the name of one person. I did contact him, a Russian, Jewish-born Russian monk living in Belgium.
I got to interview him next.
Yeah, if you could find him, I know.
You weren't able
I
to reach
tried,
him.
but he never responded to my email. I think I scared him away when I told him I divided a whole morning ritual.
Yeah.
I would spend, I got up at 3 a.m. because we started our services at 4.
When I was reading this, I was thinking, how much were you sleeping?
I was sleeping 4 hours.
Yeah, it had to be. That's awful.
I know. I was able to work my way up to that because I was so inspired to do this. And,
wow.
And then, as I mentioned, I had my brother smuggle in a talus for me. And I started, I realized, okay, I'm going to have to do this myself because I can't find anyone else who's doing this. So I would go through these Jewish prayers early in the morning, this ritual with my talus, and then I'd go to our services and, all the Christian service that we did. And at night again, I would do the same thing. I would do the Lord's Prayer, which is actually a Christian prayer, but it's really, there's nothing un-Jewish about it. The Lord's Prayer, which is probably the most famous Christian prayers, Our Father art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. It's really all very commensurate with Jewish. Apparently, it's supposedly Jesus wrote it. It's very possible he did. And but then we reached it was getting to the point when I realized that I don't think I can carry on doing this on my own, living this double life. I'm trying to merge together my Jewish identity, I started referring myself as Monk Yehuda, because my Hebrew name is Yehuda.
Were you saying that to people there?
No.
Okay, yeah, just privately.
Just privately. And I started doing the Jesus prayer in Hebrew. I translated it to Hebrew.
By the way, too, when I read that, I haven't told you this, but we have the same Hebrew name, Yehuda.
Yehuda, really?
It's the long version. It was a combined name, Yehuda Zev.
Ah.
But yeah.
Because I think it's not connected to Richard, which is my birth name. I think it's connected to my great grandfather was Edward, and I think Yehuda must be fairly close to Edward.
I don't know. My grandpa's name was also William, like me, and he was named Yehuda Zev.
Oh, so maybe.
Yeah, I think I think you just choose two different names.
Oh.
Like you have your English name, but then it doesn't exactly correlate.
I was given that name. I mean, I didn't choose Yehuda.
Well, I mean, like, yeah me too. Yeah. But I think like your parents choose both an English and Hebrew name.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. You had the same name, Yehuda.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's funny. I remembered it. I remember that was my name. So I started calling myself Monk Yehuda. When I wrote to that very well-known Jewish scholar in Berkeley, who wrote that book, that really amazing book on the Jewish Gospels of Jesus. And I was so taken in by this book, so I had to write to him, and I wrote to him about how much it really helped me really come together with my Jewish identity as a Christian monk. And he was like so overwhelmed that I wrote to him.
Wow.
And I told him, I signed it, I'm using my name, Monk Yehuda. And he really was like so impressed with all of that. And, so it got to the point when I realized that I think I have to leave. I can't really continue this, and maybe I'll emigrate to Israel because I didn't think I could live in America. Because when I became a fully born life-professed monk, I had to turn over whatever money I had, and so I really had nothing, and no credit card or anything. So, and also I had no income. So Social Security was very, very little.
And it was shared.
Yes, but then, they were getting it. But then I was able to when I left, I was able to take it back.
Oh, okay.
I mean, they couldn't keep it.
Yeah.
Because it's still going in my name, even though I had a joint account with them. But it was still under my name because, it had to be.
Yeah.
But then I was able to change that bank account, of course, when I left. But then I realized the only thing I was going to leave, because then I had chapter 10 goes through a very dramatic epiphany. I won't go into. I won't want to spoil it. I think it's one of the most dramatic moments in the book, actually.
So I won't say it.
Don't say anything. But I realized something happened during one of the services, and I realized that my faith is not really as strong as I thought, and so it was the middle of COVID, unfortunately. So it wasn't easy to leave. And eventually I did leave, though. And,
should I not spoil the outro either? The exit?
No, well, the exit is pretty...
with Father James.
With Father James, which is not... I mean, I changed his name because I thought he might be hostile.
And you said you still respect him, and you know...
Yes, although I respect him a little less. There's something... I decided not to have anything negative in the book. Mm-hmm. But something happened after I left that I think was very unfortunate, and I have less respect for him.
Do you feel open to talking about it? Or
I can talk about it because I'm not telling his real name. But when I was I went to Florida to my brother. It was the only place I could go, preparing to get my papers organized to go to Israel. But then I got cold feet. And I ended up not going to Israel.
That was the first time you got cold feet.
First time I got cold feet. I was turning 69 and I realized I didn't, mostly because I didn't think I really could afford to live there.
Yeah, Tzfat specifically, which is it's the mystical Jewish city in the north part of Israel.
That's where I was going to live.
Which is quite the experience over there. I did see it, and I hope that you do one day, just because it's interesting.
Yes, I still have an idea. I would like to go and see it if I can, because I never made it there, and even during my visit, and that's where I was going to go. But even Tzfat, which is cheaper than Jerusalem, I realized that with my Social Security, what it was, and I didn't know a single person there, and being so far away from anybody, and I thought it'd be a struggle to survive there on a daily basis. And I mean, I could have looked for work, but I don't think what kind of work I would find. So I decided, then my sister-in-law picked up on it, and she mentioned it to my brother, and my parents had basically disinherited me, which I found out at that time, but they didn't tell me, of course, because they were afraid, my mother particularly, who had more of a Jewish background, she didn't want any of their money ever going to the church or monastery. So they basically disinherited me. So my brother thought that, well, they didn't want me to get the money, obviously, as a Christian, but, he can use the money to buy me a condo.
And it seems like they didn't think it was going to go to you.
No. So I think they probably would have, and, they certainly would not have been against him buying the condo for him, using that money.
Oh, so I thought he actually bought it with his own money.
No, he didn't. He used their money. And also on the deed, that on my death, it would go to his sons.
Oh.
So it was going to stay in the family. Mm-hmm. And so I was fine. And actually, when he eventually sold it, I didn't take any money from it, any profit. I let it all go to my nephews. So I didn't want my sister-in-law to get angry.
Well, that was a question of mine.
Yeah.
Like, what? They bought
you
right,
bought it for you, and you're going to keep some money out of it. I don't know if she really would have cared, but still.
Well, no, I was just thinking, oh no, they bought it and then you left.
Yeah, really, exactly. But, yeah. No, so during that time, this was the episode.
Yeah.
The condo board, had to be approved, and for 10 years there was, they did a credit check, and there was nothing on me for 10 years because I was living in monasteries. So they did a credit check, and as if I fell off the face of the earth. They figured, well, where were you for these last 10 years? We couldn't find anything. Were you in prison? Where were you? So I figured, I got to prove where I was. So I had to contact the monastery because I needed a letter saying that I was residing there for 8 years. And I got a letter also from the other place. And so I had to contact them. And so when I contacted them, because when I told him I was leaving, I wasn't completely honest. I said I was going to continue as a Messianic Jew, connecting with Jesus, and and find a group in Israel. But here I said I'm staying in America, and I happened to mention that the condo was near 3 different synagogues. So he picked up that I'm actually just living as a Jew, and that freaked him out somewhat. And he tended to be a somewhat emotional person. And so he wrote the letter that I asked him to. Then he wrote a second letter, and the second letter was very hateful. And he addressed it. My brother didn't quite understand it, but he addressed it as, "Dear," he used my monastic name, "apostate." An apostate is someone who turns his back and renounces the church. That's the first thing. That was bad enough. But during the course of the letter, he said, "We accepted you as a brother, but you left as Judas."
Ooh. And
I tried to explain to my brother, do you realize that's a very, very bad thing what he said? He's basically saying that Judas, of course, we know, betrayed Christ. And that's the ultimate thing.
Wow.
And he wanted to make it even worse. He said, and I made, I don't know, several million candles while I was there. And obviously a couple of $1 million I as an income.
And you gave it your all.
I gave my all. I mean, all those years I worked there. And he said, what you did, you really gave very little. Something he anything I gave, you just dismissed. And then he said, I only hope that you will come to realize how the wrong that you've done before it's too late. Meaning, I am straight to hell is where I'm going. And so, I was like, this letter, it's really just so horrific. So I spoke to a friend of mine. He said, you have to burn the letter. Don't even let the letter stay. So I asked my brothers, would you help me burn? I've never burned a letter before. So we did it. We burnt the letter together.
Wow.
We burnt the letter. And so at that point, my respect really diminished because I always sensed that maybe there's a bit of anti-Semitism there. And that letter was very anti-Semitic. To call me Judas, first of all.
Yeah. Going
to hell. I mean, it was really, really unfortunate. But strangely enough, it didn't stop me. Maybe a few months later, I realized I needed a winter coat, and I left it there. And so I didn't write to him, but I wrote to one of the monks. I said, could you send me my winter coat?
Oh.
And he sent it to me.
Oh,
the monks were okay, although they were all right. Actually, this one, they were all basically very Protestant who became Orthodox.
Mm.
So they had this sort of this sense that they're not going to be against me for what I'm doing, and hoping that maybe I will eventually realize and come back. I mean, that's probably what they're thinking. But they were okay. I mean, one of them drove me to Columbus Airport to get my car, and he was very nice, and he made sure I got my car before he left me there and everything. And so, the abbot was in tears for this before he realized I wasn't going to Israel, because he thought that it was his fault. And so I felt sorry for him then. But then later on, I realized, okay.
Yeah, you said you reassured him.
I reassured him that it was not his fault. It was all my decision. It does not reflect on you at all. He thought it was his fault that I, gave up on the faith.
Wow.
So anyway, I did try Judaism. I threw myself into it full-heartedly.
You did. I was so surprised. Like,
for 6 months, I got tefillin, and I had my talis. I got a genuine talis from Israel.
I do want to see pictures of this as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have. I have a picture of me with my beard, though. My driver's license has a picture. But yeah, no, I didn't. My brother didn't take a picture of me with the tefillin on. I used YouTube videos to figure out how to put it on. but I tried the Chabad, and I was following an Orthodox prayer. But I spent like 2 hours every morning going through the Orthodox morning prayer, and I did that for like 6 months. But then when I actually went to a synagogue, I went to Chabad synagogue, I couldn't follow along. And then I went to a Young Israel, which in Century Village in Deerfield Beach, where my condo was, I always felt it really uninspiring. Mm-hmm. And the Chabad was better, but still I couldn't follow them. I could not really, I couldn't really see what they were doing. Everyone was praying on their own, and there was no way for me to take on what they're doing, and no one really offered to help me. And so I...
they will mumble through some sections and then turn 10 pages, and then all of a sudden everyone's singing at once.
Yeah, everyone knows what they're doing, but I could not follow what they were doing.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you were teaching yourself.
I was teaching myself.
And going right into Hasidic.
Yeah, I know.
Chabad is an interesting thing that I think a lot of people that are not Jewish don't know about, and that it's Hasidic Jews, like it is utmost religious.
Yes.
But they welcome in anybody
who's Jewish.
Yeah, anybody who's
Jewish.
Right.
True.
Yeah. Specifically, like my experience with them was at college in Buffalo, and just wanted a place to go to for the holidays and stuff and Shabbat dinners. Mm-hmm. They'll take in people in shorts and sneakers, and like you don't have to dress to their. They actually also, Jewish people who had non-Jewish friends, they would bring them too, and it was just, I think college specifically, they're even more open.
Yes.
But it's a fascinating, because the Hasidic, in Judaism, they're, I guess in America specifically, they took on that Christian way of having Orthodox, conservative, and different levels, whereas I think that's happened in a lot of countries, but it wasn't always that way. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting with Chabad as the bridge between.
Yes, but what really attracted to me them is that they really had the Hasidic spirituality, which was very attractive. And that's why I was hoping in Tzfat. I knew already, I'd scoped out the Chabad communities there, and I figured, I'll be in this environment, I can study the Kabbalah, and have the Chabad community, and it'd be sort of like this semi-monastic life is what I thought I would be living. And that's what I liked about the Hasidim. But of course, what I was so unrealistic about it is all about family. And I wasn't about to get married. I wasn't about to have kids. And there I am, a single person, already almost 70. And, it was just not, I was not going to fit in.
Yeah.
And culturally. And also, spiritually, I figured, this is not going to work, because they really weren't, in Florida, they really weren't that friendly.
Yeah. I'm not too surprised.
Not so surprising. So I basically then I tried some online places, and I did really like this group in the Aquarian Menial, which was based from that Rebbe, famous Rebbe
from
who started
Yeah, the
Reb Salman.
Oh, okay.
Reb Salman, who started the renewal movement, and he was a former Chabad. He was actually quite close with the Schneerson, the Chabad, who died in Brooklyn.
Yeah. He was the one that with the Chabad.
Yes, and this Reb Salman was with him, but then he broke away and got into the whole drug stuff.
Yeah, you said he was associated with Alan Watts.
Yes, and Timothy Leary.
That's when I met
the Harvard LSD people.
Yeah.
Yes, he was involved with them.
Even.
Yes, all of them.
Nice.
They were a whole group. And he founded this renewal movement. And then in Berkeley, there was this group, and it was all still with COVID, so it was all online. And I started tuning in on their Friday night services. But it was online and really couldn't connect. It was in Berkeley. I mean, it just felt too far. They were all kind of hippy-dippy like. They're all singing and everybody writing their own little songs and everything. But, it had it's nice. And I tried it. And there was a group in Florida. There was a renewal movement in Florida. I tried them. But I wasn't working. It really wasn't. I still was looking for something at least somewhat monastic-like.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd find it with Hasidim, but it wasn't going to happen.
And so we're about to transition to moving to Malaysia and going back to Buddhism. But at this point, you're 68.
I was 68. Yeah,
68. Okay.
68. That's right. I moved then to a Theravadan forest monastery in West Virginia, where I'd taken my first refuge.
Yeah.
It's a Sri Lankan place, a forest monastery, about 2 hours from Washington, D.C. Very, very nice place. And I felt a connection there to the old Sri Lankan monk who was there. And I went there to work as a lay resident for 8 months. And while I was there, I got the urge to ordain because I didn't really feel connected to the other lay residents. And I saw the monks there, and I thought, well, if I can manage it now, I'm going to see if I can ordain. But I had my 69th birthday there. But the Western monasteries, it was impossible. They would never take anyone my age. And so then I met someone there who's told me about this monastery in Malaysia. That was an international monastery with an Austrian abbot. And he said, write to him. So I wrote to him. I explained my background. I even told him about the Christian thing. I told him, as much as I could. I think he's Austrian. He'll understand, maybe. And he said, look, we don't have any age requirements here and age restrictions. But, the environment, it's kind of, it's hot, it's humid, it's tropical. It's up in a mountain. You have to see if you can physically do it.
In the jungle.
It's a jungle.
Yeah.
I was like, oh. So I said, well, all right, he's letting me try it. I'll try. This is my last chance, maybe, to become a monk. And so there I was. I go to Malaysia. My family were horrified. And he said, I'm 69. I'm going to Malaysia. It's halfway around the world. I'm going to live in a forest monastery.
I think this might have been the most stressed.
I've been the most stressed.
And this was 2020.
This was 2022.
22. Wow.
COVID was just
2 years ago.
Yeah, just 2 years ago. Yeah, it was actually the end of July 2022. Yeah, just 2.5 years ago. I went there, and it took an adjustment. It was pretty. I'm back to living in the huts. And it was built on a mountain, so there were stairs everywhere. And they did have electricity, and they had a little fan, but it's hot and humid all the time, And we had to walk down to into town to get our food at a meditation center. They were like our sponsors, and it was it was only maybe a mile and a half, maybe 2 miles, maybe a mile and a half, but it was down 250 stairs. And then down this really steep slope, and they all walk barefoot, all the monks. But I told the abbot, I said, I really don't think I can walk barefoot. He said, maybe try it part of the way, which I did the first day, then never did it again. I wore sandals, but even sandals, it was a very hard walk. You walk down, and then you have to walk back up. And even at 8:30 in the morning, it's getting hot. The sun is blazing down. There's no shade. And you're walking with your food. You're bringing it back up this hill. It's quite a journey.
I'm almost 70 too.
And I'm almost 70 doing this.
Trooper.
And then I said, okay, I somehow survive it. And then I began being introduced to leech bites, as I found. All of a sudden you start going, where's this blood coming from? Real leeches. And then I made the first step. I was a novice first. Very quickly, he realized that I was a monk in the past, so he can speed things up my age. So he was very, very quite nice. I became a novice very quickly, and wearing white robes. And then in February 2023, I became a bhikkhu again. I sew my own robes again, and at least some of them. And there I was for the second time around. I get to be a fully ordained monk. And I was wondering if I'm really going to make it for 5 years. So I thought this is really arduous, but I figured there was no place in America that I thought I'd really want to live at, any monasteries. There were so few. So I thought, well, I visited Sri Lanka, and one of the times I had to leave Malaysia to renew my visa. And I went to Sri Lanka. I really liked this place in Sri Lanka. I thought maybe I'll move there, because there were a lot of older monks there. They hardly spoke English, but I figured, well, I can try to learn Sinhala, best I could. And they were friendly, and they were welcoming, and they were older, and they were all late in life they became monks. I felt comfortable there. And very simple, very primitive conditions. So, no hot water, forget about that. No heat, no hot water. But it was hot all the time anyway. And so I thought maybe I would do that after I ordained, see if I could transfer over to Sri Lanka. But then I had these 2 mishaps in Malaysia, which I read about, and I fell down some stairs on a rainy day. And luckily I didn't break anything, but I really, really banged myself up badly, and I had all these bruises on my ribs. Very painful for a while. And then besides that, I became very fearful to go downstairs because I was afraid of falling again. And so psychologically, it really did a number on my mind. And then shortly after that, I got this very rare bacterial infection called leptospirosis, which is passed from rat urine. If you hear, I lived all those years in New York with all those rats. I never got it in New York. All those cheap restaurants I ate in. I never got it in New York. And here in Malaysia, I get it. And so I was in the hospital for 4 days. And because I got very, very weak, because I had no appetite, and I passed out at some point, and so the abbot got very nervous. So I got brought to the hospital, and they found out what it was pretty quickly. I was really pretty impressed, because I said I wanted to go to this private hospital because it was recommended to me, not to a state hospital, because I figured the quality of the healthcare would be better. In Malaysia, anyway, is far better economically than many of the other countries in Southeast Asia. So it was a nice modern hospital, and the doctor was a Chinese background and excellent English and smart, and he was able to spot what it was. He figured it out. The treatment, they started the antibiotic treatment. I had a drip 24 hours a day, and slowly but surely my body started responding pretty quickly. They were impressed at my age. Because I think when I arrived there, my blood pressure was 90/40. I was barely alive. Just so weak. And then this infection attacks the organs. So the kidneys, the liver, everything was being attacked by this infection. But it was a powerful antibiotic, and 4 days, I survived. But while I was in the hospital, I began to realize that, look, I think maybe I need to think this through about staying here, because I had that injury. Now I got this illness. Maybe it'll happen again. Maybe I'm no one else got it but me. We're all drinking the same water, eating the same food. Maybe because I'm older, I'm more susceptible. I was thinking all these things. And then there were other complications. I developed an ulcer. I don't know if it was connected to that. And then I had these swelling in my feet, and it was difficult to walk. I went to a rheumatologist, and she said it's nothing to do with the leptospirosis, it's just that you're getting older. I said, but why is it so sudden? It never happened before. I think it's the humidity. And she said, oh, no, it's not. I said, I think it's the climate. I said, I'm not a doctor, but that's what I think it is. And she said, oh, no, it's not that. Of course, she's a lifelong Malaysian. She doesn't realize that for me, at this age, I think my body wasn't happy in that climate. And so then I decided I was going to make just a rejuvenation visit to the States, just for like for the 4 months or so, 5 months. And the abbot agreed that maybe it would be a good idea just to see how I am when I get back to the States. And I was back in the States a couple of days, and all of a sudden I was back to normal. So obviously it was the climate.
Yeah. Or maybe the elevation.
The elevation.
Yeah,
so many factors. The monkeys. No, the monkeys never bit me.
So that's so interesting to be.
Yeah, so we're getting close to the present, and but it was sort of exciting leaving Malaysia because you can only stay for 3 months at a time, and then you have to leave and you renew your visa. But during one of the times I was supposed to leave is when I got sick, and so I couldn't leave, so I overstayed my visa. And Malaysia is a Muslim country, and they're not particularly happy of having foreign Buddhists living in their country. So I had to, somehow deal with the overstaying of the visa. And so the monastery had a connection. There was some woman in another completely different part of Malaysia, a very wealthy woman, who said that she had connections with someone in the office, in the immigration office in that state. So I had to go to this place, and to get there I had to take an overnight bus ride.
While you were sick?
No, I recovered at this point. Yeah. This was already, I was recovered, but I was still going for periodic checkups. Mm-hmm. So this is an experience I got to do 3 times. I took an overnight bus trip all across Malaysia, and I was the only non-Muslim on the bus. In the middle of the night, going through these dark roads because there was no highway going there. And it was like a cultural experience I never expected I would have 3 times, because I had to go there and come back, and I go back there again because the bureaucracy is just unbelievable. It's something like out of a Kafka novel. And what was so interesting is that they, in the middle of the night, it would stop, because there was no toilet on the bus. So I was so careful not to drink anything because I was afraid, what am I going to do? There's no toilet. They stopped one time. Like there was here we are in the middle of nowhere. It's like this dark road, and there was these lights. And it's like a rest stop of sorts. Like a little, I wouldn't call it a restaurant, but it was something like that. And that's the only place where you could go. And there was a rest stop where buses would stop. And, the toilets, well, choose your imagination. And I'm wearing robes, and, it's always kind of tricky, in these places.
Yeah.
They don't have toilets. It's like, the hole in the ground.
Which you were doing in the jungle, right?
I was doing in the jungle anyway. At least he was in a sort of a room of sorts. And so dirty. It's like
you almost rather be outside.
And you got the robes, and don't want anything to touch anything.
Yeah.
Oh my God! I know, sitting on the bus all those hours, the robes getting unraveled. It's hard to keep everything on, But anyway, and there I am, and people are looking at me because this is a Muslim country. I'm wearing Buddhist robes, and I'm obviously not Malaysian. But I didn't feel dangerous, but it was a little bit uneasy, that I was with all these Muslims looking at me, and no one really accosted me. But I just felt, here I am all alone.
It was
they didn't have a phone.
It was the only religion you didn't give.
I didn't give any time to. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I'm back in the States, and oh my God, it's very late.
I know. Well,
yeah. We're getting near the. So I while I was in Malaysia, I tried to find out where I could go, and I wrote to that monastery in West Virginia saying that I'm thinking of maybe coming back to the States, and they always were so friendly to me and all. And they said, well, we have a very old, the abbot was in 96, and there was another American monk who was older. They said, we really can't handle another older monk here. And so that was not going to be an option for a long-term residency. So then I discovered an American monk living in a Burmese monastery in Minnesota. So I wrote to him, and I said, I'm looking for a place to spend a couple of months. And he was very welcoming to have another American there because it was a Burmese Theravada monastery. And so that's where I went. I went to Minnesota in June of 2023. And I liked it at first. It was very beautiful. I mean, just taking walks again in a climate that I could deal with. And, that's when I started writing the autobiography. because over the years, people, kept on telling me, you got to write your story. And I said, oh, no, I don't want to write it. Too much to go over again, and too much past stuff. But I had a lot of time, and I didn't really have any jobs to do there, and I had a lot of time, a lot of hours. So I just started, and it just started flowing out. I would write maybe 2 hours a night. I would write like 5-6 pages, just like from my laptop. I just like, it was, as I was explaining to my former dissertation advisor, who I'm still in touch with from CUNY, I said, if I hadn't been an academic all those years, I don't think I could have written this so easily, because I was so accustomed. I've written so many papers, and a couple of books as well, and given so many conference papers. I was so used to expressing myself, and even in an academic way, that writing this was like easy, because I didn't have to do any research really. Just like I had all the material, just a matter of like expressing it.
Yeah.
And so I realized that the academic phase was really helpful. All that writing.
Yeah, you were accustomed to it.
Yeah.
Well, it came out great. I mean, and I think the cover is beautiful, and it really is a great story. How come it didn't work out in Minnesota though?
Well, I didn't particularly. I said I had this expectation of it being different than it was. I thought it was a small community. It was a branch of the main monastery in Austin, Texas. And these monks, from what I gathered from the American who wrote to me, that everyone does their practice, and they does their own meditation. Everyone's on their own. You do your own thing, basically. But I assumed it was going to be very meditative. And I realized that the Burmese are not really like that. Even though there's a strong meditative tradition in Burma, that's not the tradition that came to America at all. It's much more like a temple, as a cultural temple for the Burmese immigrants than a monastery. And so I didn't really felt inspired by any of the monks there. I didn't connect with the American monk. He was a little bit odd. He was an older person, a little bit older than me actually. And he writes books, and some of his books were really quite good, I thought. But he just really wasn't socially. I suppose I have this really odd way of being very quiet, very introverted, but at the same time, I could be also very social. Mm-hmm. And I also know how to have a conversation with people. Yeah. That it's a sharing. And I've met so many people, either they just only talk about themselves, and they're not interested at all in what you have to say, so there's no sharing, or they don't talk at all. And he was more like that. He just didn't really talk. And I thought, well, I think I'm going to go to Austin, because that's the larger monastery. There were a couple of Americans there, bigger. And I was a little bit concerned about the Minnesota winter. I thought, well, I don't know if I really want to brave that.
Yeah, they have notoriously cold winters.
Yes, really cold. And, this is north of Minneapolis. It's cold up there. Mm. And the monastery was very small. It was just like a residence house and a little temple. There was like no place else to go. And you just sort of isolated there. So I went to Texas, even though I knew it was going to be hot there, but I figured air conditioning would be right. So I went to Austin, Texas, and it was nice. The accommodations there were probably the best I've ever had, because you had little cottages and they had a bathroom attached. So I thought, wow, this is really quite. But there's no real sense of community. There were 2 American monks there, but everyone really just kept to themselves. And it was the Burmese cultural aspect of it that I just could not relate to. Because it really was supported like 98% by the Burmese immigrant community, who had become quite successful. A lot of them were professionals and they had money. They were the ones supporting the monastery. So therefore, the food was all Burmese and like not vegetarian at all. It was very hard for me to find something to eat. It was a struggle. And also just the cultural aspect of it. The Burmese people would come, they would be speaking Burmese. And the Americans, we would just stay quiet, because I was about to learn Burmese. It was too much. I was thinking, one of the things I've been thinking about as I'm getting older, where do I want to be when I approach death? Because it's very important in Buddhism that you're in the right situation. And I sensed that was not going to be the right place in Austin. And so I started exploring other aspects of Buddhism, and I came upon some of the teachings of Dzogchen, which is Tibetan tradition, but not the Gelug that I was in before. This is much more of a experiential tradition, very early form of Tibetan Buddhism. I became interested in that, and I started doing a lot of reading, and of course, and becoming more familiar. And then I decided I would spend the Rains retreat in upstate New York actually at a Chinese monastery, because I had a connection with the monk there who is actually Jewish, but he's a Theravada scholar monk, so he's not a Tibetan monk or a Chinese monk. But, he's from Brooklyn. We have sort of a cultural connection. He's a little bit older than me, but we somehow, he was fascinated by my story. In fact, I brought him a copy of the book, and he read it cover to cover.
Nice.
And he really praised the writing. He really liked the afterword, actually. And so I decided to spend the Rains retreat, and also strategically, once I'm in upstate New York, I decided I really would like to return to New York State, because my roots are there, not only New York City, but Oneonta, Ithaca. My spiritual journey began in upstate New York. And I always just loved this area. And so I explored then a Tibetan monastery up near Oneonta, actually. But it really wasn't a monastery. It was a retreat center like this, but no monks, only just one. And I thought, I'm not sure if that's the right place. And then I thought I would explore KTD. And I realized, okay, it seems to be much more what I'm looking for. No place is perfect, but I think this comes a lot closer. And I have also met a really wonderful teacher who's not here right now, but he's coming back. And I actually went and met him in India recently, right before coming here, to give him his cell phone that he left behind.
Just casually.
Just casually. I'll just go to India and give you your phone.
Oh,
and then I'll go to Nepal and get him some new robes and make a little trip out of it.
Yeah.
And that was actually wonderful. And then right before I came here. So, it was sort of like caught up to date, I suppose.
Yeah, full circle.
Full circle back to Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah.
And I'm using my original name that I got from the Dalai Lama.
Tenzin Lamten.
Lamten, yes, Tenzin Lamten. Tenzin is the lineage of the Dalai Lama. And there are some Tenzins here also, actually, but not for that reason. And Lamten, which actually I was not accurate in the book when I said it's the holder of the path. It's really more exactly shower or demonstrator of the path.
And this is quite the path.
And this is quite the path, yeah,
you
exactly.
You are showing quite a path.
Yes, exactly, yes.
So we made it to the present. I have a few questions, and we'll kind of wrap it up
Yes.
with it. But do you feel at peace now, where you're at?
Well, I do. I do that I feel like at peace that I have found my way to the form of Buddhism, the food of the spiritual path that I think is the right one for me. It's going to still take some more time for me to adjust, because I've been away from Tibetan Buddhism for so many years. Some of the practices I'm not that comfortable with, but there's, I think, in terms of the approach, I think this is right. KTD, I think no place is perfect, but I think I can work with the things I don't feel are perfect. And I love the area. I like the environment. And I'm prepared now at this age, as I turn 71 in a week, that I'm going to make it work, because I've been welcomed here. And I feel at peace in that way, although I'm still kind of restless in my mind. But I've only been here for 6 weeks. And I really literally just came back from those 2 weeks in Nepal and India, which was quite a rigorous trip that I took. And so a lot of upheaval. And but I am at peace, and I think that the danger is to look back too much and to think that, well, maybe if I hadn't done that, if I hadn't done this, if I hadn't stayed there so long, if I had, stayed in academia longer, if I had stayed that place longer, if I had not stayed so long in the Greek author, all this stuff, it's not helpful to think that way. Because as I realize now, as I learn more about Buddhism, that the causes and conditions, everything has to run its course. And one step led to the next. And it had to happen at the time that it happened. And if I had said that, okay, if I had stayed in academia longer, then I probably would have gone through that whole Christian route. Probably would never have done it in New York. But I realized that it was an important part for me to do it. I had to do it. It was an important diversion. And that is part of the journey. And I think it's easy for people to say that, oh, no, you probably made some mistakes. But I realized that looking back is never going to be helpful. And realizing that things happen as they happen. And to be at peace with that. And what we have now is the present. And that is what I'm working on, is to make the present fruitful and to continue that day by day into the future.
I love that. I want that to be the last question I ask because I had a couple similar ones, and I think you really encapsulated it with that. I think that's a really nice conclusion. I have a friend, I'll give a bit of a shout out. He's actually coming to visit me this weekend. And I think on brand with the Detours and Diversions, he says, and his college professor actually said this, embrace the squiggle.
Embrace the squiggle, yeah. Yes, exactly.
So, yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I appreciate you sharing all of it. This was really nice.
Well, I really appreciate your interest.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and the book is there. If anyone wants interested, it's quite a big book, but I have gotten some positive feedback from those people. Some people who have read it have really liked it, and as yourself. And I just really want to share the story. I didn't didn't write it to make money, and
Yeah, I thought it was really great. Once again, it's called Goal in Progress: The Detours and Diversions of a Spiritual Journey.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Spiritual Journey.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.